Hey, hey everyone, it's me. And I'm not gonna lie, I'm shaking writing this. I just drove back from that abandoned chapel outside Victoria, and what happened inside still echoes in my mind. Tonight, I'm sharing 20 bone-chilling true exorcisms from across Texas. Families who called for deliverance, only to unleash horrors they couldn't control. I promise you, after hearing just one of these accounts, you'll never feel safe in a darkened room again. If you're already feeling that knot in your stomach, do yourself a favor. Hit subscribe now, because once you join Creepy Vibes, you won't want to miss a single rattling whisper or shadow slipping past your vision. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it on your clock right now? Drop it in the comments and brace yourself, because we're about to plunge into 20 real Texas exorcisms that went terribly, terrifyingly wrong. Let's go. It was late October when Father Miguel Sandoval arrived at the Chapman farmhouse just south of San Marcos, the sun already dipping low behind live oaks that shivered in the crisp evening breeze. The road in was narrow and flanked by fields of tall grass, their seed heads catching the last light like tiny embers. The Chapmans, 3 generations under one sagging roof, had called him in, said their family was cursed, whispered of nightmares and a moaning deep beneath the floorboards. He'd heard worse, of course. He'd done exorcisms in cities, in hospital wings, even once on a low riverboat in Louisiana. But there was something in the way the land here pressed in, the way the air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves that made his collar feel tight against his throat. Inside, the house smelled of old wood polish and stewed greens, of children's laughter that turned too quickly to uneasy silence. Mrs. Chapman greeted him in the parlor, her hands white-knuckled around a chipped teacup, her eyes ringed with weariness. Behind her, a photograph of 3 smiling children, Rebecca, Jacob, and little Clara, hung crooked on the wall. The priest set his kit down quietly, noticing how the floorboards groaned under his weight, as though the house itself was protesting his arrival. That night, at the center of the basement, they laid out the circle. A rough ring of salt, a single black candle in a chipped ceramic holder, and beside it the family Bible, its pages yellowed, its leather cover cracked. Mr. Chapman lit the candle by torchlight, his hands trembling. "We've heard it," he said, voice low. "At night, at the edge of the salt, we've seen something move in the dark. It comes for the children's voices." Father Sandoval nodded, crossing himself, feeling the weight of their expectation more than the centuries-old rosary against his chest. He began the rites, ancient prayers in Latin that felt strange on his tongue, sung in a rhythm he'd learned in seminary, meant to bind and expel. The children watched from a worn quilt spread on the stone steps, eyes wide but curious. Clara clutched a rag doll like a talisman. As he spoke the words, the air in the basement grew colder, so cold his breath clouded in front of him. The candle flame flickered, soft wind stirring the edges of dust motes that danced like tiny specters. At first, there was silence, only the steady cadence of his prayers and the scrape of old pipes somewhere overhead. Then, low beneath the hum of his voice, came a sound, like a creature in pain, moaning through the walls. It started as a whisper, then swelled to a guttural keening that rattled the wooden beams above. Father Sandoval paused, heart hammering, and felt the ground tremble underfoot. The salt ring shimmered as if rippling in water, and the candle wavered, its flame drooping toward the page of the Bible. He resumed, voice stronger, more insistent, calling on the names of saints, on the power of the cross. The moaning turned to anger, a rasping roar, like nails dragged across metal, echoing in the hush of the old house. Mrs. Chapman ran to the stairs, Jacob after her, while Rebecca and Clara clung to each other on the landing. The priest stayed in the circle, beads slipping through his fingers as sweat beaded on his brow. The candle guttered, then went out, plunging him into darkness so complete he could no longer see the salt at his feet. He fumbled for matches, swore softly, struck one against the wooden box, and the tiny flare revealed that the salt ring had been broken. A crack ran through it as wide as a man's fist. The grains spilled outward, mingling with something darker, soil that seeped up from the basement floor, wet and alive. Father Sandoval's match went out, but by then he could feel it. The thing crouched beyond the circle, its breath hot on the back of his neck, teeth scraping together somewhere behind the blackness. He reached for the holy water, but his hand passed through a shape, cold and viscous, and recoiled. "Sanctus," he whispered, voice trembling. He splashed the water into the air, but it sizzled on contact with something unseen, punching holes in the silence that hissed like steam. The children screamed as a shape lunged into the circle, a shadowy hand clawing at the rim of salt, pulling loose stones from the foundation. Father Sandoval cried out, lunged forward with the crucifix, but the thing met him halfway. He felt teeth sink into his shoulder under his cassock, a surge of black blood, and the circle cracked again. In that moment, light flooded the basement, brighter than the sun, so white it burned his eyes. He staggered back, blinded, and heard a chorus of whispering voices, not in Latin but in a tongue he did not recognize, layered like a choir of children. He felt flayed, as though every prayer he uttered stripped another layer of flesh from his soul. The light receded as quickly as it came, and when he dared to open his eyes, the thing was gone. The basement was silent, the salt ring shattered, the water bucket upturned. Only the Bible lay open, its pages blank, its words erased. He staggered upstairs, gripping his shoulder where the blood had soaked his sleeve. The family rushed to him, their faces pale as the walls around them. "What did you see?" Mrs. Chapman asked, but he only shook his head. He had no words. He could only feel the memory of 1,000 small voices laughing in the dark. Feel the cold of that thing's breath as it whispered promises, that it would wait in the walls, in the earth under the house, in the live oak roots that wound beneath the floors, until a reckoning came. Father Sandoval left San Marcos at first light, sun burning the dew off the fields, stopping only once to look back at the old house. It stood silent and still, smoke curling from the chimney like a question. He drove away with the taste of salt and soil in his mouth, the memory of that basement echoing in his ears. Weeks later, he heard secondhand that the Chapmans had moved. The house sat empty now, the windows boarded, the gate chained shut. Locals walked past it quick, heads down, feeling the weight of something watching from within. Some say at night you can still hear children laughing in the walls, and if you press your ear to the door, the old farmhouse moans, like the land itself is in pain, grieving what was unleashed. Father Sandoval never returned. He never spoke of the Chapman rite again, but sometimes, in the hush before dawn, he wakes and whispers prayers under his breath, as if calling on saints and angels, asking them to guard his soul. He says no one understands what crawls beneath the walls of a place built on blood and memory, that some doors once opened never truly close. And if you ever drive that road near San Marcos, past the fields that glow gold at sunset, you might glimpse a light in a boarded window, flickering like a candle, beckoning, and hear, just for an instant, the creak of floorboards and a murmur. We're waiting. The wind came off the Gulf like a warning, heavy with salt and something older, something aphotic and briny that swirled across the sand in low clouds. Father Ignacio Santos had spent his life listening to winds, how they whispered through the eaves of Corpus Christi's battered churches, rattled the shutters on fishing shacks, skated across the bay like a silver blade. He knew the language of weather and water better than most, and when Sister Marisol arrived bleeding saltwater tears, flinging herself at the confessional rail and begging for deliverance, he believed her. She carried a rotted driftwood crucifix in one hand and clutched her rosary so hard the beads were smooth as pebbles. Her eyes scrolled in their sockets, as though searching for something lost beneath the tide. He set her up in the old boathouse behind St. Augustine's, propped her against the peeling planks, and asked her name. She whispered in his ear in a voice like lunar dust, like something layered under her own, "Marisol, I am Marisol." But the voice rattled its syllables out of cadence, dropped consonants in places that made Father Santos shiver. He prepared the water, vials of blessed salt water he had distilled in a brass chalice, stirring it with a prayer so ancient the words left his tongue like moth wings. He sprinkled the first drop on her forehead and watched the skin flare red, as though the expulsion of darkness scorched her flesh. She screamed then, not in pain but in something more feral, like an animal whose prey had slipped its grasp. The boards shuddered with the force of it, and he swore for a holy moment that he heard the hull of a fishing trawler creak in the distance, though the docks were empty. He pressed on, reading the exorcism aloud, the litany of saints, the castigation of demons, the gentle coaxing of her soul to reclaim its body. Each word was a shingle in the hovel of his faith, and he nailed them together against the storm he sensed gathering just outside the boathouse door. Midway through the ritual, the moon slipped behind a cloud and the tide moved in. He should have felt it more in the plaster of the walls, the floorboards, but the boathouse trembled too faintly for the shifting sea to register in his bones. Marisol went silent, her chest rising and falling with a regularity that chilled him. He spoke the final words, "Go forth, unclean spirit," and waited for the familiar thrash of the possessed body, the rattling voice begging for mercy. But there was nothing. Nothing but the hush of the wind and the slow drip of blessed water pooling at her feet. He moved to stand, knelt by her side to offer the sign of peace, and found the water had darkened. Veins of black slithering like ink spilled onto a page. The scent changed then, from salt to something acrid, like burning tar mixed with brine. He staggered back, tripped over a coil of rope, and heard Marisol breathe deep like a child tasting air for the first time, but her eyes were gone. In their place were two mirrors, flat and gleaming, reflecting the corners of the boathouse and something else, a shape too low in the frame to make out, coiled where the tide would soon lick at the shore. He scrambled to his feet as the board beneath him creaked in protest. The brass chalice toppled and rolled past him, spilling the last of the holy water. The black tide surged toward the rotted sliding door, and for a heartbeat the priest thought he saw fish, tiny, silver-eyed fish, swarming over the boards inside, as though the gulf itself had crawled in to watch. A voice, layered and thickened, crawled out of Marisol's mirror eyes and spoke in the timbre of the sea. "You cannot drown what already breathes beneath." He raised the crucifix, pointed it at her, but the bronze flickered in his hand like a candle in the wind. The tide lapped over the threshold, first a trickle, then a flood, as the channel between land and bay vanished beneath churning water. The boathouse became a vessel, listing and alive, and Father Santos realized that this was not exorcism but invitation. The spirit had been waiting for the salt, for the moon to slip free of cloud, to flood the thin membrane between worlds. He lunged for Marisol, but his knees buckled in the brine as his feet found nothing but rotted wood beneath the rising surf. He heard her laugh then, soft and cold, and the mirrors in her sockets glinted. The water swirled around him, carrying him toward the door, toward the gulf that had answered his prayers with an offering of teeth and oil-slick darkness. He wanted to cross himself, to call on the Trinity, but the water was in his mouth, and his own voice was swallowed by the churning blue. He felt the shape coil around his ankles, as cold as the shadowed depths, and knew that the gulf had claimed a new convert, dragged him beneath the surface with arms of foam and death. In the end, the boathouse door jarred open at midnight, let in the full moonlight, and the tide poured out like a confession. All that remained was the crucifix floating face down in a puddle of blackened water, the beads of a shattered rosary scattered across wet boards, and the empty frame of a body that had been both sinner and saint. Corpus Christi's saltwater exorcism had become its own abomination, a cleansing that invited the swamp, the deep, the hungry darkness to walk among the living. And when the fishermen returned at dawn, they found only footprints in the sand leading to the water's edge, and none that led away. The first time Father McCullough set foot in room 613, the carpet's pattern seemed alive, twisting beneath his polished shoes like a slow-moving fever dream. He kept his eyes fixed on the peeling wallpaper, the kind you see in late-night motels off the service roads where travelers vanish behind deadbolts and never check out. He didn't look up when the door clicked shut behind him. He'd learned long ago that something in that room liked to watch through the ceiling fixtures, the vents, even behind the mirrored dresser. Bishop Carmichael followed behind, clutching a battered satchel that had seen more midnight exorcisms than any priest's bag ought to, yet nothing had prepared him for the hush inside. Father McCullough's hand hovered over the brass rotary phone on the nightstand. The phone itself looked ancient, its ivory face cracked, the numbers worn smooth. It was strange to find a rotary phone in a 1980s-era build, but there, snarled among the knotted coils of its cord, was the heart of something hungry. They called it the conduit, though no one remembered who first gave it that name. McCullough had heard the sermons spun in parish halls, metal demon, voice box from hell, call me, prayers interrupted by scratching on the line, whispers between static and hiss. He reached for the receiver and felt the wood grain beneath his fingers shift, breathe like a living thing. Are you certain we need both of us? Bishop Carmichael's voice was low, reverent, but edged with tension. He set his satchel on the bureau, the crucifix rattling inside. McCullough slid the receiver into his palm. He asked for company, he said, though the words tasted wrong. McCullough had been on the road so long that loneliness had become familiar. Solitude was as comfortable as a well-worn cassock. But loneliness stinks in room 613. Loneliness here invites the shadows to curl closer. They stood in silence for a moment. The only sound was the ancient telephone's dial tone, wavering like a sigh in the stale air. Then, from corner to corner, the shadows seemed to collapse in on themselves, and the dial tone fractured, warping into a syllableless moan. Bishop Carmichael swallowed. McCullough held firm, turning the dial 1, 2, 3, an old trick. You broke the ring, you broke the thing it fed on. When he cut off at 9, the line went dead. Air pressure seemed to shift, the room exhaled. The priests shared a glance. No exorcism yet. No spectacle of flying chairs or walls weeping black. This was worse. Silence so thick you could wear it like a cloak. They moved towards the bed, center of the room, mattress stained a dull rust. No body, no signs of struggle, no open Bible, no overturned chairs. Yet every hair on McCullough's neck stood upright. Then the walls began to chant, a language unknown. No Latin, no Aramaic, no saint's name rang out. It was human, but warped, words pulled through a rotten sieve, tongues flicking like worms. Bishop Carmichael clutched his missal and began, "Do you believe? Do you agree?" At first, a prayer, but the syllables shifted. "Do you believe? Doubt. Doubt day." The words twisted, the letters unstitched themselves, floating free in the space like dead motes in a sunbeam. The chamber of their minds rattled. They had learned long ago that you didn't plug your ears to this. It would find another way, slither through your heart. McCullough stepped forward. "In the name of—" He could not finish. The chanting became a laughter too heavy for human lungs, echoing through the vents. The window rattled. The hiss of static poured from every outlet. The priests looked to the door, still locked. What small grace to be trapped. In his bag, the bishop's crucifix glowed faintly. He drew it out, swollen with dew under its glass. "Saint Michael, defend us, pray for us." His voice cracked. He advanced, the cross raised, but the closer he got, the smaller it looked, like a toy. The rotary phone began dialing on its own, click, 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 over and over, turning the dial until it snapped free of its mount and rolled across the floor to McCullough's feet. The coil wound around his ankles. He fell to his knees, pins and needles crawling up his calves. The chanting shifted pitch, like a choir of drowned things surfacing from the lake outside. The priests knew that sound. It came from the deep places where mercy ran out, where men prayed and got nothing but coal-black ridicule in their ears. Carmichael dropped to his knees beside McCullough. "We must pray together," he breathed. The bishop's hand closed around the old man's, urging him to join. McCullough shook his head, eyes wide. They looked up at the air, where hundreds of tiny motes spun in a grim ballet, illuminated by the flicker of a lone bedside lamp. A single motile eye formed in the dust cloud, red as a dying ember. Then a voice, quiet and resigned. A whisper, "Help. Me." It pressed against McCullough's ribcage like a child's hand. He froze, arms raised with the crucifix. Did he dare respond? A human voice from that void. "Who are you?" he whispered back. The eyes in the light pulsed. "I was one." The static turned crimson, spidering across the peeling walls. They never learned. The phone at McCullough's feet spun again, dialing without end. Each rotation peeled away a digit, stripping the numbers of their threadbare sheen. The receivers on the cradle danced to contact corners of some endless network. A phone book in hell. The bishop closed his eyes, reciting the exorcism prayer under his breath. Words of power, of binding, dripping from his lips. But each syllable seemed to age and fracture in the air. Mercy itself wavered, and the cross in McCullough's hand loosed its grip. The bishop's prayer became a litany of cracked glass and distant, mocking applause. McCullough felt sweat trickle down his spine. He tried to stand, but the coil held him prisoner. Above, the vents rattled. An old hotel, thin bones of pipe that no longer served water, now conduits for whispers from beyond. A rasping breath filled the grill and outpoured a shape that roiled like smoke. A man's silhouette, wearing a priest's collar. Featureless, colorless, dripping static along the edges. "Why do you torment me?" the indistinction rasped. It stepped from the vent, its shape sliding down the wallpaper, leaving black footprints in the carpet. The bishop opened his eyes and saw no face, just a glimmering void that swallowed the lamp's glow. Clutched in the thing's hands was a tattered Bible, pages torn, words scrawled in blood. The priests recognized its binding, centuries old. An American prayer book from the earliest missions, defaced. The shape knelt before them. "I have called," it sighed, voice softer than a breeze through a graveyard. "You refused. I asked for absolution, but you offered nothing." Its hand hovered over McCullough's bound wrists. The coils tightened, biting flesh. McCullough gasped. The bishop lunged forward to free him, but the apparition raised its head. Its eyes, if those black holes could be called eyes, fixed on the bishop. A cold pulse radiated outward, and the bishop's knees buckled. From the phone beside them came the faint echo of a child's cry. McCullough remembered old stories, the child sacrifice left unavenged, the creak of the old rotary lines tethered to that room's history. He felt himself with effort, pressed his forehead to the carpet. "We are sorry," he whispered, voice ragged. "We failed. Forgive us." The room held its breath. A moment passed. The coil slackened and fell away. The phone stilled. The faceless priest stood and raised the tattered Bible. Flames burst from its pages, blue and hungry. The wallpaper caught fire along the edges, curling like black petals. The bishop dropped onto his side, choking on the acrid smell. McCullough crawled to Carmichael's side and pressed the bishop's hand to his chest. "Pray," he rasped. Together, they forced words from cracked throats, weaving their broken faith into the smoke. Outside, sirens wailed, a callback to their summons earlier, the call they thought had been cut off. Someone had raised the alarm. The flames recoiled as if stung by holy water. The faceless shape tilted its head and for the first time seemed uncertain. The dust motes scattered, and the phone slipped from the bedpost into silence. The shape dissolved into the walls, into the cracks, until nothing remained but a scorched outline where it had knelt. The door burst open. Firefighters, paramedics, the chaos of rescue. Father McCullough and Bishop Carmichael lay side by side on the floor, breathing as though they'd swum through rivers of glass. The bishop looked at McCullough and tried to speak, but only a hoarse croak came. McCullough managed a nod. When McCullough finally rose, he left the phone behind. The rotary dial was frozen, one number missing. Room service would find it later. The burned-out phone, the ashes, the lingering helplessness in the carpet. Room 613 would go back on the books, cleaning crew bound to scrub and resell. He and Carmichael would move on to another call, another decrepit room, another hungry space. But something lingered in them, a syllable of that unnameable tongue, coiling in their dreams. Every night McCullough heard the whisper through the static of his own phone, "Help me." And he knew that as long as that room remained unatoned, the call would come again. And next time, he might not answer. The wind off the Neches River carried a damp chill through the ornate bay windows of St. Mary's Chapel as Father Elias Byrne stepped inside, his black cloak brushing the polished wood floor. Outside, the late afternoon haze clung to the cypress trees like ghosts. He had been summoned, not by any parishioner, but by a worried county judge whose nephew, the groom, had sealed the plea with a promise of hush and heavy coin. The judge's letter spoke of a bride struck down at the altar, her body convulsing as though seized by unseen claws, uttering words in a language no living soul recognized. Father Byrne had encountered many things in his 25 years. Children haunted by invented specters, devils masquerading as long-lost relatives, and the remembered nightmares of war. But this was different. The letter hinted at something ancient, something older than the Christian rites etched into the stone walls of this chapel. He felt it before he saw it, a low hum, like the grinding of stone, a pulse beneath the silence. He moved through the empty nave, rows of velvet-topped pews lit by stained glass that painted the floor in bloated colors. His fingers brushed a hymnal, and the pages flipped as though caught in a breeze that didn't exist. A solitary candle burned before the sanctuary, its flame flickering despite the still air. Beyond the altar, he could hear muffled voices. Confessionals, perhaps. But when he peered inside each stall, they were empty. His chest tightened with a familiar tug of dread, but he steadied himself. He had come to break a demon's hold, to bring the light of God into a place now tainted. Byrne followed the voices down a narrow corridor to a side chapel. There, on a rickety folding table, lay the bride, Maribel Dupré, pale as white satin, her lace gown stained already, though the ceremony had ended less than an hour ago. Her hair lay in golden tangles around her head, and her lips, cracked and crimson, trembled on words she could no longer contain. 4 Dupré, all men, stood around her in a circle, their faces gaunt and lined as if carved by unseen knives. The groom, Charles Dupré, knelt nearest her, his dark eyes void of tears, his mouth a thin line. "Father, thank God," he whispered, relief wedged between his words. "We need you." She spoke the oath in that tongue. His voice was hollow, less a cry for help than an invocation. Elias knelt beside Maribel, crossed himself, and laid 2 fingers on her forehead. The cold of her skin bit through his gloves. He murmured the exorcism prayers, his voice measured. But as he began, a low chant rose from the family, matching the rhythm of his Latin, a terrifying mockery. Their voices intertwined, a sonorous drone that pulsed in his skull. He stopped, razor-sharp panic lancing through him. The groom's father, a stooped man with fingers like telescope lenses, muttered in a phrase that bore no resemblance to any verse Elias had studied. The words were soft, but cut the air like razors. Byrne straightened and drew back. The chapel's candlelight flickered wildly, shadows tearing themselves from the corners, writhing and flickering across the walls. He whispered urgently for the family to stop, to let him from their incantation, but their eyes remained fixed on the bride, unblinking and fervent. In that circle, Elias saw the mothers and daughters and sons of Dupré stretching back centuries, their blood oath older than the church itself. He saw a map of bones that led to a hidden spring in the swamp beyond Port Arthur, where ancestors had drunk from brackish waters to bind their souls together. A promise sealed in flesh that no priest's blessing could sever. He knew then, this was no simple possession. This was a pact handed down from father to son, a covenant older than land deeds or court licenses, older even than the timber beams in this chapel, and they had married Maribel into it. She had thought she wed Charles. Instead, she had pledged herself to something far darker, a lineage of devotion to an entity that lived in the murk beneath the river's surface, in the shifting mud and the sulphurous decay of cypress roots. And with her collapse, the old ones had awakened. Elias drew the cross from beneath his robes, letting it hang before him like a shield. He spoke the writ of excommunication, the final condemnations meant to sever a soul from infernal bonds. The men halted their chant, as if dragged by an invisible leash. Maribel's body convulsed once more, and a voice emerged. 2 voices, layered, one brittle and terrified, the other deep and mocking, as if speaking from behind a curtain of water. "You cannot break what was formed in blood," it rasped. "Our daughter, our bride, our sacrifice." The steeple bell tolled midnight across Beaumont, its knell deep and resonant, though the town clock hadn't struck. The whole chapel shook, wood groaning like old timber in a gale. Windows blew inward, shards of glass raining down around them, yet no wind blew. Elias pressed the cross to his chest and began the opening recitative of the rite of separation, the extirpation of unholy unions. His voice cracked, but he forced the words out, each syllable a hammer blow. The men reeled back, faces contorting, eyes blackening. Charles Dupré clutched the hem of his father's coat, caught between triumph and terror. Maribel's voice, sweet and frightened, broke through the rising storm. "Father, help me." The plea cut deeper than any blade. Elias surged forward, pressing both hands to her temples, heart pounding so fiercely he feared it would explode. "In the name of the Father," he shouted, the chapel echoing. "In the name of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, Amen." He ended with a crack, as if a whip had snapped through the air. Then the darkness broke. A scream tore from the congregation as something invisible crashed into the back wall, splintering plaster. The men fell to their knees, weeping and clutching their throats, mouths open in silent agony. Maribel's body arched once, her head whipping back, hair swinging like a pendulum, and then she collapsed into stillness, her eyes fluttering open to reveal only white. Elias sagged against the altar rail, sweat and blood mixing in his collar. He looked up at Charles, who trembled, tears sliding down his cheeks in thick rivulets. "It's done," the priest said quietly, though he knew it was no victory. The oath had been broken, but the price was the knowledge of what lay beneath the riverbank, what had been awakened. He thought of the families upstream, drinking water from wells, of children playing at the river's edge, of the silent decomposition of reeds and frogs. A darkness older than the church had stirred, and once roused, it never slept. By daybreak, Maribel would rise again, her mind small and pliable, but the stain would remain. Her dreams tainted by the cold hush of subterranean currents. And the Dupré would return to their plantation house, to the family vault beneath their porch, where bones rested in clay-lined niches. They would lock away the memory of what happened, bury it in whispered prayers, and sealed lead boxes until the next bride came. Elias Byrne gathered his robes and extinguished the candle, returning the cross to beneath his cloak. Outside, the first rays of dawn cut through the mist, and the steeple stood silent, as if untouched by the night's horrors. But he knew better. Beaumont bore new scars, and somewhere in the swamp something watched, waiting for the blood that had sown it back into this world. The old Fellner house on East Abrams Street had been empty for decades, its windows boarded and its paint peeled like dead skin. But when the Skeletal Library Paranormal Society announced their seance to contact the spirit of little Amelia Riggs, the 6-year-old girl who'd been strangled in her own bedroom in 1978, half of Arlington turned out, armed with Ouija boards, Emily Dickinson poems, and trembling flashlights. We'd gathered in what they called the Spirit Room, a former nursery on the second floor, its floral wallpaper stained with mold and long-forgotten tears. The air tasted of mildew and old sorrow, and when the 6 of us, 2 skeptics, a local lore blogger, the group's founder, a medium named Celeste, and me, drawn by curiosity and a ghost story I couldn't shake, took our places around the rickety walnut table, the single electric bulb overhead flickered as though some unseen hand toyed with its filament. Celeste had begged us to leave our phones outside. She said no device could carry the weight of what wanted to speak. I slipped mine into my jacket pocket, its screen dark but pulsing in my palm like a heartbeat. We placed our hands on the table's warped surface, and Celeste began in a hushed tone. "Amelia Riggs, we call you from the other side. Show us a sign." The table shuddered as though seized by a tremor, and the bulb overhead flared and dimmed. At first, the planchette moved in tiny jitters, spelling out "hello," and the skeptical woman beside me let out a strangled laugh. But then the letters came slower, deliberate. SAVEME. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. a voice in my mind that sounded like a child begging not to die, and Celeste's eyes fluttered shut as she breathed, "Amelia, you're safe now. Tell us what you want." The room seemed to inhale, heavy and suffocating. And then all 6 doorknobs turned at once, rattling in their plates, though each door remained shut. Celeste's hands clenched at the table's edge as if to keep herself anchored in our world. "She's telling us she can't leave," she whispered. The bulb blinked out, sending us into darkness. My heart slammed in my ears. I fumbled for my phone, only to find it already dead. Panic rose. A soft giggle, unmistakably a child's laugh, echoed off the walls, taunting us. The table slid closer to the north wall, scraping the floor so hard its legs splintered. Fear pinned us in our chairs. We whispered frantic questions, but Amelia answered by forcing the planchette to move so fast the wood blurred beneath our fingers, spelling out, "Trapped." In that moment, the door behind Celeste groaned and swung open, then slammed shut on its own. The group's founder yelled, but no sound came out, as though the room had sucked our voices into some bottomless well. Light returned in a sudden flash as the bulb burst with a loud crack, leaving a single pool of yellow glow around us. Shadows danced on the walls like living things. Celeste began to sob, her tears spilling onto the table and hissing as they landed on the splintered wood. "Please," she choked, "help her." The lore blogger reached to steady her, and the moment he touched Celeste's shoulder, the medium's face contorted into something alien, eyes rolling back until only the whites showed, and she rasped in a voice that wasn't hers, "I am hungry." The table vaulted upward as though pushed by an invisible fist, and we all jumped back, stumbling over chairs and each other in the tight room. The door behind me slammed so hard the frame splintered. Celeste's body collapsed to the floor, inert. In the yellow halo of the bulb's light, I saw her chest rise in shallow, mechanical breaths. Amelia's voice, faint but unmistakable, whispered from the darkness, "Friends?" We scrambled to the broken door, but the hall beyond was swallowed in pitch black, thick, viscous dark that resisted our feeble flashlight beams. The planchette skittered across the floor, spelling out, "Stay." My mind teetered on the edge of reason. The skeptic woman, pale as chalk, started sobbing, "This is bullshit," but her voice cracked like a child's. I wanted to grab her and pull her back to sanity, but my arms felt like lead. Another giggle echoed, close enough that I could feel a breath on my neck. A soft thump behind me, like a doll dropped onto wood. I turned, and in the gloom I saw the carved wooden rocking horse, once hers, moved on its own, slowly rocking front to back to front, despite no wind or draft. We were not alone. Then came the whisper, so quiet I thought it was my own mind. "I want to play." We backed away, but the planchette spelled out, "No." I felt the weight of dozens of unseen eyes upon me. Our flashlight beams converged on the far wall, where a child's handprint had burned through the old wallpaper, raw and red, though no blood was there. The skeptic screamed as her flashlight died, plunging us into absolute darkness. My phone glowed. Suddenly, screen flickering alive with a message typed across the home screen. "Welcome home." My spine jolted. I fumbled to read the text, heart thundering. The door groaned open, and pale light spilled in from the hall, illuminating a small figure standing at the threshold, a little girl in a nightgown, hair matted, eyes hollow wells. She smiled. "You're mine now." The table lifted itself off the floor as if buoyed by the air. We watched it float, spinning, rising. Celeste crawled to her feet, eyes blazing with unnatural light, and she looked at each of us and said, "Amelia never left." Then the bulb popped, and everything went black. I felt an icy grasp on my ankle and skidded across the floor. The girl's laughter, high and cold, filled my skull as I clawed at the door, but it wouldn't budge. From overhead, the low whisper, "I'll never let you go." My flashlight flickered back on for a second, and I saw the medium, her face split in a grin so wide it seemed her jaw had torn to her ears, and behind me, the chairs had assembled themselves into a ring around the table, cordoning us in like prey. Something wet brushed my cheek. It wasn't air, it was something else, something wet and warm, and I realized it was a tear, but not mine, it was Amelia's. Then the final message on my phone. Forever. The lights died for good, and the world became nothing but echoing giggles and the soft sound of the planchette spelling one word again and again. Play. I can still hear it at night. Dust clung to the soles of Marta's boots as she picked her way through the scrub that lined the decrepit levee road, the late afternoon sun bleeding crimson across the dusty plain. She had grown up here. 6 generations on both sides, border farmers and mule skinners whose lives were entwined with the Rio Grande's lazy curve. But tonight, the edge between water and land felt like a razor's lip. The dusk wind carried distant echoes, or so she told herself, shapes in the hush that rose and fell with the river's lapping. Her brother, Tomas, walked a pace behind, clutching the heavy leather satchel they'd found hidden in their abuela's dusty attic, the one stamped with ancient symbols and the faint odor of brimstone. They'd thought it was a costume prop, some old Huchol peyote ritual kit abandoned by itinerant artists, but the symbols glowed faintly at dawn, as if they'd soaked up the moonlight through the rafters. Papa had laughed when she showed him the satchel, wiping sweat from a furrowed brow, but Abuela, long silent these past weeks, had gone white, her eyes hollow wells. She muttered prayers in an archaic tongue, her voice trembling. "No si permit cruzar," she kept saying. "No si permit cruzar." She refused to explain, only rocked in her chair and stared at the far wall, where the shadows shifted in unnatural patterns. So they'd come here, at her insistence, to the old boundary marker where that rusted iron sign read, "United States. Mexico. No trespassing." A dozen yards away, half buried in the sand, stood a stone altar, crudely carved with the same glyphs on the satchel. The mortar around it was cracked and dry, but Marta could smell something deeper in the soil, a primeval stink of sulfur and rotted flesh. She knelt beside it, fingers brushing the rough carvings, fingers turning black with grime. Tomas set the satchel down, unbuckling it with shaking hands. Inside lay a coil of barbed wire, old but sharp as sin, and 6 chunks of obsidian, each the size of a fist and polished until they caught the dying light like malevolent stars. A threaded cord held them together, slick with dried blood that still scented the air with copper. Abuela said it was a binding, Marta whispered, reaching for the wire, to keep La Bestia on the other side. Tomas nodded, swallowing. They'd heard the stories. Cattle slaves found mutilated at dawn, their flesh peeled back in perfect geometric slices. Children who wandered off in the mesquite woods, returning hours later mumbling in tongues unknown. Footprints in the mud that melted away if you stepped in them. All blamed on something that crossed the river under cover of darkness, drawn by grief, by loss, by the scent of human sorrow. They wrapped the wire 3 times around the altar's base and laid the obsidian stones at each cardinal point. The ritual called for blood, fresh, warm blood. So Thomas pricked his palm with a knife and let the ruby droplets fall onto the stones. They sizzled on the obsidian, as though the stones drank them in like thirsty hounds. Marta's breath caught, half in awe, half in dread, as the air around them shivered. The river's steady murmur turned into a low, ragged whisper, as if thousands of voices had started singing in tongues beyond human reach. She looked up at Tomas and saw his eyes widening, his pulse thrumming at his throat. Maybe it was the desert heat playing tricks, but the sky seemed to ripple, dark clouds spilling out of the horizon like ink in water. A sense of wrongness coiled in Marta's gut, an almost physical weight that pressed her forward, toward the altar. She reached for the satchel's leather flap, uncinched it, and pulled out a single feather dyed black, its tip crooked like a twisted horn. Abuela had said it was a crow's feather, taken from a murder scene, dipped in moonlight and consecrated with words no Christian would dare utter. Marta crushed the feather between her fingers, grinding its barbs into the obsidian, and watched as the glyphs on the stones ignited with a pale, sickly glow. At that moment, the Rio Grande churned violently, a wall of water rising without thunder or wind. The humid air snapped cold, each blade of grass stiffening as frost seeped from the soil. Marta's hair plastered to her forehead, and Tomas hissed her name, but the glow birthed a shape in the maw of the river. A silhouette vast and rotting, a leviathan that rose from the depths like a carcass pulled from a grave. Its body was a patchwork of decay and hunger, eyes glowing orange in its sunken skull, maw dripping with sludge that smelled of drowned towns. They should have turned and run, but gravity itself seemed to trap their feet. Tomas tried to speak, tried to curse the thing, but words failed him as the creature lifted one skeletal arm, razored bones clicking like the gears of a curse. With deliberate slowness, it extended a gnarled finger toward the altar, wrapping itself around one of the obsidian stones. Marta screamed as the stone blackened, then shattered, shards flying into the night, embedding in the soft flesh of her arm. She felt agony flare, blood bubbling up through her veins, and panic clawed at her mind. Half of her wanted to flee, half wanted to finish what they'd started, to push the ritual through. Then she heard it, a voice inside her head, soft as broken glass. "Feed me. Give me your sorrow. Let me take them." She staggered back, shaking her head, but the voice pressed in with relentless hunger. Tomas fell to his knees beside her, eyes locked on the creature, his hands rising in a plea. "You won't have her," he shouted at the darkness. "You'll not cross our world." His voice cracked, but the thing did not recoil. Instead, it leaned forward, tongue slick as oil, sliding out to taste the air. In that moment, Marta understood the power of the binding and its fatal flaw. They had bound it not as a jailer but as bait, the blood on the stones a beacon. It had never been meant to keep the evil back. It was meant to draw it forth, to give it form, to let it feed on the souls of those who dared summon it. Abuela had known this, and in her madness, she'd tried to protect them by locking the satchel away, burying the altar in sand. But the ritual was never about closure, it was about invitation. Lightning split the sky upstream, striking the water with a thunderclap that shook the levee. The creature's form thrashed, each movement warping the earth, and under its ribcage Marta saw shapes writhing, pale and faint. Lost souls, tethered to the beast like marionettes, their hollow eyes begging for release. It was the faces of every person who had vanished in the jangles of the desert nights. Farmhands, hitchhikers, children who chased stray dogs into brush, now bound to this hungry thing. Each stolen breath fueling its endless hunger. Marta thought of Abuela's final words. No se permite cruzar. But they had let it cross, by blood, by sorrow, by the call of the void they'd lighting in desperate faith. Tomas reached for her hand, his skin slick with sweat and blood, and she gripped him back, all her fury channeled into that single act of defiance. The ritual spoke of sacrifice, but not theirs. The beast demanded the souls it had already claimed, a toll it would never repay. Marta knew what must be done. She raised the satchel, pulled free another obsidian shard, and drove it into her own palm, letting the hot pain bloom. Blood dripped onto the exposed roots of the altar, and she screamed, but it was a cleansing scream, a promise of vengeance. The creature recoiled, its form wavering, the voices inside it rising in anguished chorus. Tomas joined in, wrenching the other stones loose, hurling them into the river. Each stone that birthed foam and colorless sparks felled a fraction of the beast, its bulk dissolving into mist that reeked of rot. Marta staggered toward the riverbank, bleeding and shaking, as the shadows of the souls drifted free, pale shapes flitting toward the moonlit water. Their whispers were blessings and curses, a promise that they would never forget the debt they owed. With a final, thunderous wail, the beast collapsed, a cloud of black feathers and ash that spilled into the Rio Grande, carried off by the current toward an unknown horizon. Marta dropped to her knees beside Tomas, hands slick with blood and dust, and let the cold water wash over her wounds. The desert was silent again, save for the river's sigh. In the distance, a coyote howled, lonely as regret. They sat there until the first hint of dawn kissed the horizon, the sky pale pink against the ruined altar. Marta closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, one she didn't understand but felt in her bones, and when she opened them, she saw two small shapes at the river's edge, a little boy and girl, pale and translucent, hands reaching for her. Ghosts of the lost returned at last. Marta held out her arms and they drifted into her embrace, their cold weight a reminder that some debts never truly die. The water lapped around their ankles, and somewhere above, the sun climbed, shedding light that felt too bright, too hopeful for a place where evil had found a doorway and been forced back by flesh, by tear-stained blood, and by the sorrow of those who refused to turn away. The wind came first, a low moan twisting around the eaves of the old Strand buildings, rattling broken shutters and carrying the scent of brine and dust, as if the Gulf itself were coughing up ghosts. It was the kind of wind that made a man feel small, helpless, brushing away what little warmth was left behind him. On the night the hurricane's eye settled over Galveston, a ragged cast of ministers, Methodist, Baptist, Episcopalian, gathered on the Strand under the half-light of storm-torn lanterns. Their robes were soaked through, plastered to their forms like seaweed, and their voices wavered as they began to chant. Some had come seeking absolution for sins they'd never fully understood. Others thirsted for signs that God would spare their souls once the storm broke. They formed a loose semicircle facing the Gulf, backs to the town that slumbered under creeping water, and raised their hymnals high, pages dripping, voices trembling at first, and then gathering strength in a single howl of piety and fear. The drums of thunder rolled beyond the seawall, and lightning sliced through the gloom, illuminating each man in stark relief. Sharp cheekbones, deep-set eyes reflecting the flicker of lantern light, mouths clenched in fervor. Reverend Mallory, carrying a battered silver cross, recited lines from Isaiah, voice growing more insistent, as if he were trying to brute force the words into the very fabric of the night. Beside him, Pastor Green muttered an older prayer, one he claimed had saved his grandfather from the yellow fever. A prayer in a language no one present recognized, syllables like broken glass. The congregation of clerics followed his lead, mouth to mouth, syllable by syllable, until their combined utterance formed a chant that spiraled upward, joined by the howl of the wind. The air shifted, temperature dropping so fast it felt like walking into an open freezer door. A salt spray whipped around their ankles, hissing through the cracks in the wooden planks, as seawater rose inch by slow inch. They did not pause. They could not. Their voices, wild and raw, blasted into the storm's heart. People who later spoke of that night said it sounded like a choir of drowned men, calling out for rescue they knew would never come. When the eye passed overhead, that brief, eerie calm fell like a death rattle. Wind stilled, rain ceased, and in the sudden quiet they heard their own breaths, ragged, uncertain. The ministers dropped their hymnals, stared at one another in disbelief, hearts hammering in their chests. In that unnatural hush, Reverend Mallory stepped forward, head bowed, and whispered, "It is done." But the calm was a lie. The second wall of wind arrived with the force of a charging herd, and with it came something else, a low, keening wail that seemed to rise from the pavement itself. It vibrated through their bones, not quite human, echoing the cadence of their prayers. Some trembled, hands over their ears. Others only stared, mouths hanging open, faces drained of blood. The wail grew louder, and in the swirl of lantern fire and lightning, shapes emerged in the haze. Figures that looked like the ministers themselves, mirrored in rain-soaked glass, only twisted. Torsos elongated, arms bent backward at the elbows, eyes hollow and gleaming with hunger. One by one, those shapes drifted toward the real men, gliding over the rising tide as if they were carved from shadow. Pastor Green fell to his knees, hands clawing at the wood planks, eyes glued to the figure that bore his likeness. "You cannot have me," he sobbed. But the shape answered with a voice like dry leaves, whispering back the exact words of his grand prayer, only turned inside out, as if a mirror reversed the world. He screamed, and in that second, the doppelganger reached out, long fingers brushing Green's cheek, and the minister convulsed, collapsed face first into the water. When the men knelt to pull him up, his body was gone, replaced by a single wet footprint that faded into the wood. The others scattered, stumbling over planks and broken crates, but all the streets beyond were swallowed by darkness and water. They ran without direction, calling each other's names, but the hurricane's roar masked every voice. The Strand became a winding gauntlet of flickering lamps and swirling mist, full of voices, some crying for help, some cursing. Their own prayers turned inside them like knives, and in the darkest moments they thought they heard God's silence answering back. Reverend Mallory, clutching the silver cross, staggered down an alley toward the sound of a woman's voice singing a hymn. It was Sister Alvarez, known for her gentle lullabies, but this song was distorted, a child's chorus trapped in the reeds of the wind. He called to her, voice hoarse, and she turned. Her eyes were bright pinpricks of light, smile too wide, and as he reached out she mouthed the words of her song, but her throat made no sound, just a wet, gurgling rasp. Mallory recoiled, tripped over debris, and struck his head against a fallen sign. When he awoke, the world tilted, the sky a churning bowl of black and green, and the water had swallowed everything to his waist. From the depths came silhouettes, ministries, fishermen, families, all reaching upward, dripping with salt and mud, mouths open, silent. They grasped at Reverend Mallory's ankles with clammy hands and tried to draw him under, their faces soft beneath the water, eyes pleading. He kicked back, dropped the cross, and fled. Behind him, echoes of his own prayer chased him down the flooded street, collapsing on the wind until it was only a whisper on the tongue of the storm. He stumbled onto the seawall, feet pounding wet concrete, water surging at his heels, and in that moment he saw it. The vortex, a great, swirling maw of wind and rain, centered where the Strand met the Gulf. It spun like a cathedral dome inverted, clouds plunging down into a point of nothingness. He understood then that this was what they had invoked. Not mercy, not shelter, but a portal. And through that portal spilled forms like the lost souls of Galveston's past. Travelers who had vanished in storms, children swept from porches, sailors drowned in the bay. They poured from the vortex in a torrent of wailing shapes, drifting across the surface of the water, searching for names, looking for bodies to fill. Reverend Mallory raised his arms, his voice cracking as he tried to cry out, "No, this cannot be your will." But his words were snatched away by the wind. He felt hands on his shoulders, cold, insistent, and he turned. There stood the ministers he had prayed with, each with eyes black as tar and smiles that tore their faces. One reached for him, finger bones clicking like broken sticks, and in their eyes he saw invitation and hunger both. They whispered his name, each voice layered into a single sentence. "Join us in the vortex where God cannot reach." The seawall cracked, water lapping over its edge, and Mallory felt the pull, a gravity of grief and salt that tugged his boots from the concrete. The ministers closed in, chanting a final benediction twisted by the storm, and as their voices merged with the hurricane's roar, Mallory's last thought was of dry earth, of a world he had known before prayer betrayed him. Then he was sucked into the vortex, body spinning, mind unraveling, swallowed by the wind and the water and the ceaseless hunger of the invocation they had dared to speak. And for hours afterward, the eye lingered, a quiet wound in the sky before the second cycle of fury began. Only this time, when the calm returned, the strand was empty, save for one silver cross, floating face up in the rising tide, inscription worn away by salt and storm. And in the stillness you could almost hear a faint chant, echoing from the deep. The first time they stepped through the rusted iron gate, the air tasted of old dust and something sour, like the memory of fear. The orphanage sat behind rows of knotty oaks, its brick wings crumbling where ivy crawled like creeping veins. The caretaker, an old man named Palmer who smelled of stale coffee and mothballs, had nightmares so vivid that he'd wake in the dead of night calling out to children who never existed. He said the walls wept at midnight, that tiny hands tapped from the crawlspaces, that a lullaby sometimes drifted down the hall when the windows were sealed tight. When the team arrived, 3 skeptical urban explorers and a documentary filmmaker, they thought they could placate his terror. They brought sage, they chanted prayers, they smudged the hallway with salt. They set up cameras in the nursery, microphones in the boiler room, and sat in folding chairs under dim lantern light, waiting for a flicker, a whisper, a sign. At first, there was nothing but the echo of their own breathing. The orphanage groaned like an old nightmare releasing its grip, settling into silence. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper patterned in chevrons, once bright yellow, now chalky ghosts. They found rusted cribs bolted to the floor, each with scratch marks on the hardwood planks where children must have writhed against their bindings. Paint chips scattered like brittle confetti. The caretaker watched from the doorway, eyes sunken, haloed by his own trembling lantern. He nodded as if grateful to have company, then shuffled off to his small apartment in the west wing. Part office, part bedroom, part tomb. They unrolled their cameras, turned on the recorders, and waited through an hour of nothing. Then the nursery lights flickered. A single bulb winked and shuddered, and in its glow the cradle at the far end shivered. One explorer reached out, hand jerking back as if he touched a live wire. The filmmaker whispered, "That's good." The old man's chant of protection slipped over the mic, tinny and breathless, and they all laughed, a brittle sound in that hollow space. But deep in the orphanage, something stirred beyond their cameras. It slid through the vents, skittered under the wainscoting, touched the inside of their skulls with cold fingertips. It tasted their disbelief and grew bolder, pressing at the edges of the circle they thought would contain it. By midnight, the air crackled. The nursery staff room down the hall banged its doors as though someone pounded behind them. Doors in the east wing slammed shut in succession. The laundry room, the attic stairs, the bathroom no one dared enter. A lullaby seeped from the hallway speakers, warped and slow. A child's voice singing, "Hush, little baby," off-key, warping into a guttural moan. The filmmaker checked his watch. 12:17 a.m. They had seen phenomena before, lights, recordings of disembodied voices, but something in Palmer's voice, a ragged edge of terror, made it real. He led them down the corridor to the original chapel, a vaulted room where the orphans once prayed for supper, for warmth, for love. Now the pews lay broken, splintered like cracked ribs, and the stained glass windows gaped empty. On the plaster walls, scrawled footsteps of children who fled in terror traced a path across the whitewash. "They never left," Palmer said. "They just changed." A breeze rippled the papers on the altar, though the windows wouldn't open. On the floor, footprints and dust led up to the pulpit, stopping 6 feet from the top. Nobody noticed the shape beside the altar until it rose like a bubble of darkness, swallowing the last bit of light in the room. 4 small hands formed at its base, palms pressed against the wall. They slid up and down. The filmmaker's camera swung around to capture it, his lens catching the glint of moonlight on tiny fingernails. Behind them, whispers slithered through the room, dozens of them rising in chorus. The lullaby resumed, this time in perfect pitch, but layered over itself, 1,000 voices singing in unison. The old man dropped to his knees, tears carving tracks through the grime on his face. "Let them out," he sobbed. "Let them free." The explorers backed away, and in unspoken terror they realized that the barrier they thought they laid with salt and prayers wasn't holding. The air around them went thick, like syrup, as forms emerged from the corner shadows. Children in tattered clothing, faces turned downward. They coalesced into solid shapes, limbs bending at odd angles, their movements jerky, puppet-like. They drifted forward with the cradle, eyes fixed on their caretaker. He crawled forward too, arms extended in supplication. "They're mine," he rasped. "I kept them safe. They belonged to me." Behind them, a door slammed open, leading into the basement. A cold wind poured out, carrying with it the smell of rot and old laundry. The children turned as one and slid into the basement doorway, beckoning. The old man rose, shoulders slumped beneath the weight of a lifetime of guilt. He smiled, hollow, desperate, and followed them down into the darkness. The explorers hesitated, glances flitting between each other. The filmmaker lowered his camera, lens fogging with condensation. One of the group, a woman with steely eyes, whispered, "We can't leave him." Before anyone could argue, she charged toward the open doorway, lantern held aloft. She stepped inside. The others followed, in too deep now to turn back. The basement stairs smelled of damp earth. At the bottom, rows of child-sized lockers lined the walls, each one with a small padlock. Some locks dangled open, empty, others clanged shut. The lantern did little to penetrate the darkness, but as they moved deeper they saw scratches on the concrete floor. Thin, frantic lines where children must have dragged themselves. The lullaby drifted up from overhead, muffled, as if the vents themselves sang it. They came to a larger chamber, the center floor pitted and smeared. Toward the far wall, an arched opening led to another room. Forms huddled inside. Dozens of children, bodies pressed against each other, eyes like shuttered windows. No whispers now, just the soft tat-tat of fingernails on brick. One of the explorers, voice shaking, said, "They were never orphans. They never even left." The others realized then that Palmer's nightmares had been true warnings. The children had been born here, had lived and died here, and the old man had bound himself to their restless souls. His exorcism of their memories, if that's what it was, had freed him from his guilt, but had released something far older, far more vicious. The real haunting, thriving now in the bowels of the orphanage, waiting to claim anyone who ventured too close. A single cry, sharp, childlike, mocking, echoed among the rows of lockers. The children's heads turned in unison, gazing at the intruders. Their mouths opened wide, and from the darkness poured a swarm of whispers growing into a roar. The explorers stumbled back, tripping over broken toys and splintered benches. The lantern dropped and rolled, flame guttering out. They scrambled for the stairs, hearts drumming like war drums. Behind them, a child's voice called out, clear and innocent, "Don't go." They reached the top step, gasping in the sharp air of the nursery. The door slammed shut below, and the lullaby died. Silence pressed in. They bolted through the hallway past the chapel, past the shuttered rooms and out into the night. The caretaker's nightmares had ended, but the orphanage now dreamed of new visitors, voices to fill its empty halls, souls to trap in the endless cradle rocking through the night. The iron gate clanged shut behind them, and around the building the windows pulsed with a pale, hungry glow, waiting. The highway wind rattled the windows of the rented van as Marla Davenport steered through the dead streets of southwest Houston, headlights catching flickers of neon crosses that blinked in the distance like wounded insects. She'd been following rumors of something unspeakable in that isolated church. Rumors whispered by truckers at rest stops and late-night DJs who claimed they'd caught more than static on their porch cameras. She'd come because she believed in ghosts, in the half-glimpsed truths that hid behind Sunday sermons and sanctuary walls. She never imagined how right she'd be. When Marla arrived, the church stood in a haze of buzzing light. 4 fluorescent crosses cut into the peeling stucco facade, each one a sickly pink glow that chattered like cicadas, as if laced with static. The heavy doors were propped open, swinging wide on squeaking hinges that echoed across cracked pavement. Inside, the sanctuary was bathed in that same neon glare, the rows of folding chairs arranged in concentric arcs facing a low stage, every seat occupied by shadows. From a distance, she thought them people, parishioners clothed in crisp suits and cotton dresses, but as she moved closer, she saw they were nothing but living darkness, their faces blank hollows, limbs bent at odd, spider-like angles. A heavy voice rumbled from the stage before she even saw the man behind it. He stood beneath a 5th neon cross that floated midair, wires snaking from it like veins. He wore a loose white cassock that swallowed his frame and obscured his feet, and in his hand he clutched a microphone that looked ancient, its metal casing scratched and tarnished by years of sermonizing. His lips never moved, but the voice came from his chest like a beast awakened, each syllable dragging itself through the neon haze. "Brothers and sisters," he intoned, "tonight we gather in the house of illumination, to tear the veil between the living and the unseen, to call forth the souls whom God himself abandoned in the dark." Marla's pulse hammered as she slipped into the back row, the shadows parting for her like a liquid sea. She fumbled with her camera, hands trembling, trying to find focus in that pulsing pink light. But the lens kept fogging, coating every shot with smears of crimson haze. The televangelist raised his arms, and the crosses flickered in a dizzying rhythm that made the room spin. He began a low chant, syllables in a tongue she couldn't recognize, ancient, guttural. The shadows leaned forward, stretching their limbs toward him. A deep hum began to throng in the air, vibrating through the concrete floor. Marla tried to steady her nerves, but every instinct screamed at her to run. Instead, she whispered into her recorder, "This is Marla Davenport, Houston's neon church ritual. I'm live." Suddenly, the hum became a roar, and the fluorescent crosses surged with blinding light. The shadows convulsed, cracking like broken glass. One by one, they dissolved into motes of black dust that spiraled upward, coalescing above the pastor's head into a writhing column of darkness. It twined around the neon cross, suffocating its light until the glow sputtered and died, plunging the sanctuary into a yawning, electric night. Marla's breath caught. In the sudden void, she heard 1,000 whispered prayers, a cacophony of voices, some pleading, some wailing, some cursing. The pastor's chant faltered, then resumed with a staccato urgency that rattled her spine. The column of shadows pulsed, and from its depths emerged faces, faces marred by anguish, lips peeled back in silent screams, eyes empty pits of hunger. They drifted down the aisles, passing through empty chairs, their forms distorting as they searched for warmth, for life. She raised her camera again, but the display fizzled. In that darkness, she realized she was too late to document what she'd come for. She was part of it now. A cold hand brushed her shoulder. She spun around, heart pounding in her throat, expecting one of those hollow wraiths. Instead, the pastor hovered behind her, mouth inches from her ear, words rumbling in that unnatural bass. "Welcome, sister. We've been waiting." She tried to scream, but found her voice gone, swallowed by the shadows that now pooled around her feet. The pastor's cassock whipped around her, tendrils of neon light lacing between folds of fabric. He pressed the microphone to her lips, and his voice poured through her throat. "Speak the invocation." She choked, trying to pull away, but the chair legs snagged her jeans. The faces in the column drifted closer, skeletal hands grasping at her heels, at her coat. Her lungs burned. The pastor's weight pressed her down until the pew beneath her cracked, splinters digging into her skin. "Speak the words," he growled, and the neon cross above him flickered back to life, that pink buzz washing over her like poison. The faces moaned, forming a ring around her, their empty eyes fixed on her like a tribunal, sentencing her soul to darkness. In her mind, she saw every hollow church she'd ever entered, every whispered promise of salvation that turned to ash. She felt the weight of every prayer that went unanswered, every cry for mercy that faded into silence. And in that moment, the words came unbidden. She felt them crawl through her, each syllable a shard of glass. She spoke, and the shadows recoiled, convulsing in a frenzy of agony. The pastor's eyes blazed with neon fire as the invocation built to a crescendo. The walls of the church rattled. The columns shook, the faces screamed in a chorus of terror. Then everything snapped. Light exploded. The neon crosses shattered like neon fireworks, raining shards of glass and electrical sparks. The column of shadows imploded, sucking the pastor into a vortex of light and blood. Marla saw his body twist, flesh unraveling like thread, bone spooling out behind him until nothing remained but a dripping stain on the cracked floor. For a heartbeat, the sanctuary was still. Then the doors slammed shut with a deafening crack. The remaining glass cascaded down, carving red lines into the concrete. The hum throbbed again, lower, deeper, like a heartbeat reversed. Marla crawled to her feet, chest heaving, blood trickling from a gash on her forehead. She grabbed her recorder and whispered, "It's over." But the device was dead, just a lifeless brick of plastic. She stumbled toward the exit, half blinded by sparks that still flickered in her vision. She reached the doors and pushed, but they wouldn't budge. The glass panes were intact, but the heavy wood felt like iron. Behind her, footsteps echoed, slow, deliberate. She swallowed her fear and turned, camera swinging useless at her side. The shadows had returned, fewer now, but solid again. They blocked every aisle, their forms no longer hollow but filled with a faint, pulsing light, veins of neon pink coursing through their black skin. They advanced, whispering, calling her name. Marla backed away until her shoulder hit the wall. She pressed her palm against the peeling paint, feeling the church's heartbeat beneath her fingers. Her breath rasped. Then, without warning, the back wall exploded inward. Sunlight flooded the sanctuary as a dozen uniformed officers charged in, weapons drawn, flashbangs burning through the darkness. The shadows recoiled, dissipating like mist in a storm of gunfire and screams. Marla collapsed, clutching her camera, watching as the officers cornered the pastor, if that rotting husk could still be called a man. He stood beneath the crippled neon cross, face peeling off like a mask, eyes gaping voids. The lead officer shouted, and a taser bolt crackled through the air, striking the pastor in the chest. The man convulsed, and a wave of darkness sloughed off him like molting skin, swirling around the taser darts before it vanished through the broken roof. The neon crosses died for good. The sanctuary went quiet, save for the hiss of flashbangs and the ragged breathing of the living. Marla felt bones in her chest loosen with relief. She pressed her camera to her ear, hoping for one last recording. But all she heard was her own heartbeat, wild and unsteady. Outside, the world waited in the brilliant afternoon sun, oblivious. As she stumbled into the brightness, Marla knew no one would believe her. The footage she needed had been destroyed in the static. The pastor would walk free, if he walked at all. And he would keep praying, keep chanting, keep summoning until souls bled through the neon crosses once more. She walked away slowly, the hum of the city rising around her. In her pocket, the recorder clicked off. The shadows still whispered her name, trailing her down the cracked sidewalks, a promise that this ritual would never truly end. I pulled onto the battered dirt road just south of Lubbock as the last threads of dusk slipped behind the cotton fields. The windmill farm rose before me like a skeletal army, frozen in mid-March, its steel blades catching the dying light. A thin, acrid smell hung in the air, burnt oil or old fear, and I swallowed it down as best I could, gripping the wheel of my aging Ford. Reverend Cole, I reminded myself. I'd come to cleanse a troubled soul, not run from specters. I stepped out into an almost unnatural stillness. The wind, I'd learned, was the lifeblood of these turbines. Here it hovered, waiting. The only sound was the distant thrum of a single blade turning, a lazy groan as it ground through a reluctant breeze. Pastor Cole, I told myself, find your courage. I had heard the tale months ago, a young ranch foreman named Clayton Burnett who'd begun to speak in voices that weren't his own. He'd laugh deep and hollow at midnight, then weep like a child at dawn. Tools were broken, livestock slaughtered for no reason. But the townsfolk, hard-nosed West Texans proud of their ranching bloodline, wouldn't call in the sheriff. They'd whispered instead for a man of God. Underbrush crackled as I made my way to the cluster of trailers at the farm's heart. A lantern swung at the hitching post, its flame buffeted by nothing. Clayton stood by the fence, muttering to himself as the metal windmill above him creaked, the blades slicing the air in lazy arcs. I approached carefully, collar turned up against an unseen chill. Clayton Burnett? I said softly. His head jerked toward me. His face was drawn tight, eyes too bright. He blinked, and for a second the man I remembered from the photos, a rugged kid with a shock of dark hair, was there. Then the twitch at the corner of his mouth. A smile split by shadow. "They told me you'd come," he said, voice doubled, a lower undertone murmuring behind my name. "They said you'd help me." I held out the small silver crucifix I carried, a gift from my old mentor. "Let me pray with you, son." His eyes flicked to the crucifix, and I saw, before I knew it, his pupils stretched into black holes, absorbing the lantern's flame. The night grew colder. The lantern's glow dimmed. I forced myself to speak, words of benediction spilling free. At first, Clayton's shoulders shook with laughter, a sound like wind howling through empty barns. Then he screamed, a piercing, torn cry that felt as if it might split my head in two. He stumbled backward, and I caught him, guiding him toward the trailer where a Bible lay open. Beyond us, the turbines whirred to life all at once. I looked up. 50 blades began to spin, faster and faster, though the air was still. The farm trembled, and dust rose in little whirlwinds around our feet. My prayer faltered on my lips. Inside the trailer, the walls were scrawled with symbols I hadn't studied in seminary, circles and spirals twisting into each other like the blades outside. A low chanting pulsated through the thin walls, and I recognized words I'd only ever read in forbidden texts. "We are the harvest. We are the seed." My heart pounded as I realized Clayton wasn't alone. The creature clinging to him was older than memory, born of restless plains, fed by currents coursing through iron. A windmill demon, farmer's legend, nothing more, until tonight. I gripped the crucifix tight, stepped toward the door, and called on Elijah, on Michael the Archangel. My voice echoed oddly, swallowed by the howling turbines. The crucifix pulsed cold in my hand. I held it to Clayton's chest, willing the blessing to drive the demon out. The blades above groaned, then began to spin backward, a sight that wrapped my gut in ice. I'd seen reversed winds once during a tornado, nature undone, and this was worse. The metal cut through space as if tearing a portal, wind sucking outward instead of rushing in. Clayton, no, the thing wearing Clayton, roared and leaped at me, claws raking across my arm. I stumbled back, blood blooming on my sleeve. Through the pain, I kept reciting the Lord's Prayer. I had to stop the windmill. I raced outside as a gale hammered me, each breath a blade slicing my lungs. The turbine's hub loomed above, gargantuan, monstrous. I climbed the maintenance ladder, fingers slick with sweat and blood. My vision swam. The crucifix felt like lead. At the top, the hub's bolts had loosened, fallen free of rust and time, and I saw the demon's fingerprints in the grooves. It had been here long, shaping its prison into a tool. I pressed the crucifix to the metal, praying that holy silver could undo the evil at its core. Lightning split the sky, though no storm came. Electricity arced around me. I heard Clayton's voice, pleading, crying, "Help me. Please, Father." "By this sign," I shouted, voice raw, "be gone." I thrust the crucifix into the hub's center, where the power conduits converged. The world tilted as an explosion of wind and light ripped outwards. I was thrown clear, tumbling through the dark. I heard the turbines groan, then crack. They slowed, blades juddering. The backwards spin ceased, and one by one the windmills came to rest, their chrome arms pointing skyward like surrendered swords. Silence plunged down, unnatural and complete. I lay in the dust as dawn cracked the horizon. The first rays of sun struck the crucifix, embedding it in the hub as if it had grown there. Clayton, real Clayton, crawled from the wreckage of the trailer, eyes human once more, his hands covered in oil and rust. He stumbled toward me, voice unsteady. "You saved me." I pushed myself up, blood still dripping from my arm. The crucifix quivered faintly in the hub, smoldering with energy I couldn't name. I wanted to tell Clayton it was over, that God had answered. But the morning light lay across the turbines like a shroud, and in every still blade I saw a shape, a face, a grin, and a whisper carried on the breeze. "We harvest still." I left Clayton by the road, words failing me, and drove away as the sun burned away the night. Behind me, the windmills stood silent, but I knew better. Evil left scars deeper than metal and wood, rooted in the land itself. And somewhere down the line, when the wind turned just right, those blades would start again, spinning backward, calling to what sleeps beneath. And when the crucifix failed, the demon would rise once more. The road was darker than it should have been. The neon of Amarillo's Route 66 highway signs had flickered out hours ago, leaving the asphalt swallowing headlights like an open grave. Joshua Riggs slowed his rusted Chevy pickup as the chapel's pale glow came into view, a single lantern hanging above its weathered wooden doors. Prayer had always been his refuge. His mother's soft hymns echoed behind his eyelids when nightmares struck, but tonight, something pressed against the darkness that felt less like solace and more like a maw waiting to close. He killed the engine and watched the chapel's windows, narrow slits of milky glass, warped like blurred memories. A pine cross perched atop the sagging roof, its beams rotting with age. A porcelain dove statue stood sentinel in the cracked cement steps, wings chipped and eyes clouded. Joshua remembered seeing photos in a roadside pamphlet. How this place had once offered weary travelers rest, kindness, the promise of reprieve on dusty nights. Now the hush of wind whispered through splintered shutters, and Joshua wondered if salvation had bled out of these walls long ago. His boots crunched on gravel as he approached. Cold air carried the faint scent of incense and something metallic, like spilled blood dried into the earth. Joshua laid a hand on the door. A heavy plank scored with parallel gouges, as if someone had tried to claw their way inside. The lantern's flame trembled, casting dancing shadows that stretched like fingers crawling across the floor. He eased the door open and slipped inside, voice catching as the wind slammed it shut behind him. The latch clicked, and for a moment the world outside felt miles away. Rows of pews faced a creaking pulpit. More candles lined the walls, their wax half melted, wax tears pooling on wooden sills. Joshua's heart thudded as he flicked on his flashlight. The beam fractured on the crucifix above the altar, God's face upside down in the flicker. Kneeling benches were empty, but footprints, wet and dark, marred the dust. They led from the entrance to the altar and then continued behind it, disappearing into a narrow corridor blocked by a tattered curtain. Joshua swallowed. He wasn't alone. Something had emerged here tonight, summoned by desperate faith or darker curiosity. He remembered the rumors. Travelers entering in hope, never leaving. Whispers of voices crying out for mercy. Prayers cut mid-chant. He forced himself forward, each step heavy in the hush, as if the air itself resisted his presence. He stood before the curtain and backlit it with his flashlight. The fabric was stained, brown and red, and the light revealed handprints smeared across it, grasping at the fibers. Joshua closed his eyes for a heartbeat, then yanked it aside. Beyond, a narrow stair plunged downward, damp stone slick with mold. The lantern light from above barely pierced the gloom. He fumbled in his pocket for a second flashlight, lantern swinging above him. Descending, the air grew colder, thick with the stench of rot. At the bottom, a vaulted chamber stretched out, its ceiling hidden in gloom. Joshua felt the hush press against him, and he patted his pockets again for his phone. No signal, dead battery. He cursed under his breath. Alone, no witnesses. A perfect trap. In the center sat an altar of rough-hewn stone, scratched with words he couldn't decipher. On it lay a Bible, its pages yellowed and brittle, open to a passage about deliverance. Beneath the text, smeared in something dark, someone had scratched a shape. Triangular, jagged, bleeding into the paper's fibers. Joshua moved closer, lantern light pooling on the offering. He felt breath on the back of his neck and spun around, heart seizing. The corridor behind him was empty, but low chanting echoed, distant and ragged, as if carried on a breeze from beyond the chapel. He strained to make out words, half prayers, half curses. The air pulsed, alive with intent. Joshua swallowed. His rational mind screamed to flee, but faith anchored him. He remembered his mother's gentle voice. God never turns his back on the faithful. He whispered a prayer, and the altar trembled. A figure flickered at the chamber's edge, half seen by candlelight. Tall, gaunt, draped in shadows that clung to its bones like a second skin. The chanting rose to a rasping crescendo. Joshua's legs shook, but he stepped forward, lifting the Bible. In the name of... His voice died as the figure glided closer, its mouth twisting into a grin that fractured bone and hope. The candle flames guttered, shadows flickering across the walls in a dance of revulsion. The presence touched the altar, and the stones wept a blood-like ooze that pooled at Joshua's feet. He took a backward step, but the exit lay behind him. He forced himself to look at the figure's face, where vacant eyes burned with starvation. I come in peace, he stammered. The thing's grin widened, its jaw stretching as if it had no skin. Voices rose in unison, hundreds of whispers swirling until they became a cyclone of sound that rattled his ribs. Joshua clutched the Bible, the pages crumbling under his grip. "Begone!" he whispered desperately, then louder, "Begone!" Silence exploded around him. The figure halted, its grin frozen. For a moment, Joshua believed he had banished it. Then a low knock sounded at the chamber's entrance, soft, deliberate. Joshua's blood ran cold. He turned to face the door, heart pounding. The knocking came again, slow and measured. He crept forward, lantern held high, and the curtains billowed inward as if drawn by an unseen hand. He hesitated, tears stinging his eyes. "Pray for those lost souls," his mother's voice chided. He reached out to touch the curtain. A force slammed through him, a gale of rancid air that knotted his stomach. The world behind the veil erupted in flame and bone-shaking roar. He threw himself backward, fleeing up the stairs as the chanting turned to shrieks. He burst into the chapel, door swinging wide to the empty night. He stumbled across the pews and flung the door open. The chapel stood silent beneath a moon too pale to comfort. Joshua fled to his truck, fumbled with keys, and tore down the highway, headlights bobbing against the horizon. He dared not look back. Behind him, the chapel's lantern blinked once, twice, then extinguished. In the rearview mirror, windows gleamed for an instant. Empty, yet something watched him from within. Joshua drove until dawn, praying until his voice rasped. He never spoke of that night again, but sometimes he woke screaming, hands clawing at the sheets, eyes shining with fear. And every year on the anniversary, he found a single black feather on his doorstep, soft as a whisper, cold as the hands that had tried to claim him in Amarillo's roadside chapel. Nothing about that night felt right the moment Father Moreno stepped onto the shadowed stone walkway of the Riverwalk. The faint glow of lanterns willowed along the arched bridges, throwing quivering shapes against the rippling water beneath. It was almost midnight, and the usual hum of tourists was gone, replaced by an uneasy hush that pressed against his chest like cold hands. He carried a small silver container of holy water, its lid rattling softly against the glass, and beside him walked little Isabel, her cool hand clutching his sleeve. She was 6, maybe 7, with big, dark eyes that reflected the glow of the river and the flicker of lantern light. Her soft face seemed too innocent for this place, yet she looked curiously at the dark water, her little skirt lifting in a breeze that smelled of algae and something fouled beneath the surface. Father Moreno paused where the water widened, where centuries of stories and secrets slipped under the stone arches like hidden currents. He forced a calm he did not feel. The blessing was supposed to be simple, a gentle ritual to honor the unsung souls lost in the river's ever-turning tides. But the moment he raised the silver bowl and spoke the first words, "In nomine Patris," the air changed. A shudder ran through the walkway, as if the river itself had exhaled in terror. Isabel gasped and slipped from his side, splashing into the dark water before his eyes could even blink. He dove without thought, plunging through velvet black water that swallowed his cry. Below the surface, the current tugged at his clothes and spun him around, but he felt instinct, strength, the iron command of adrenaline. He found her cradled by the gentle curve of a submerged ledge, her small body trembling but miraculously unhurt. She stared at him with those wide eyes, and that look was not child's fear but something older, something ancient and alive. She reached out and he took her arm, dragging her toward the surface where moonlight fractured on her hair. She did not scream, did not cry. Instead, she murmured a soft sound, an incantation in a language that twisted at Father Moreno's stomach and squeezed cold dread into his heart. He dragged her onto the walkway, coughing and gasping and clutching her tight, and she clambered up of her own will, brushing water from her curls. He held her close, noticing how her skin shimmered in the lantern light, wet like the surface of something not quite water. She sniffed once, and then looked up at him with those deep dark eyes and said, "It's here, Father. It's blessed me." He blinked and blinked again. "Isabel?" He tried to soothe the tremor in his voice. "What happened? Can you tell me?" She tilted her head, water dripping from her eyelashes. "It spoke to me. It told me I would be safe if I chanted." He froze, his heart pounding. Chanted what? She stood and began to move her lips in a series of soft syllables, the same guttural sounds he'd heard beneath the water. Strange, ancient, wrong. The words rose and fell in a droning rhythm that seemed to echo inside his skull. He watched in horror as her small body swayed and the river around them stirred, ripples forming arcs of inky foam that licked the stone walls. "This isn't a child's prayer," he whispered. Isabel paused, blinking at him. "It's the river's tongue," she said. "It remembers." Father Moreno took a step back. The lamps around them flickered, the glow wavering like candle flames in a storm. He stumbled but held to her, afraid she might slip away again into the dark. "We need to go," he said, voice shaking. "We must return to the church." She nodded dutifully, but the chanting slipped from her lips in quiet gasps, a lullaby to something deep below. He wrapped his arm around her and began the slow walk back through the arches, each step hollow beneath his feet. The lantern seemed to dim, and the water's surface turned a deeper black, as though it watched them with hungry intent. They passed one of the hidden alcoves, where a wrought iron gate led to a narrow tunnel beneath the banks. Father Moreno remembered the legend. Centuries ago, a convent of sisters had vanished, leaving behind only distorted echoes of their hymns, and local lore said their prayers were still carried by the river. He glanced at Isabel. Her eyes reflected that same distorted echo. She turned toward the tunnel and whispered, "They call from here." He gripped her tighter. "No," he said, "we don't go there." She looked at him strangely, her expression blending innocence and something else, reverence, devotion. "But Father, they asked for me." She pulled forward, tiny feet moving toward the iron gate. The lock was rusted, but the door swung open as if invitation had eased it free. Father Moreno roared, but it came out as a choked whisper. He tried to pull her away, but found her weight heavier than a child's should be, her skin colder. As they slipped past the gate, the river's murmur turned to chant, ghostly sisters singing a hymn in that same alien tongue. The darkness of the tunnel was absolute, and he fumbled for his flashlight, its beam trembling and weak. Inside, the walls were slick with moisture, faint carvings visible in the crumbling stone. Faces with hollow eyes, mouths open in silent screams. He shivered and hugged Isabel to his chest, trying to shield her from whatever lurked ahead. She pressed against him, humming the chant, and the sound filled the narrow hall, pressing on his mind with relentless insistence. He knew he should turn back, should drag her into the night air, but her head lolled against his shoulder, and he felt a magnetic pull deeper into the earth. A deep voice rose in the darkness, low and sonorous, as if the river itself had taken human form. "Child of water, child of stone, you have come home." Father Moreno's heart slammed as he swung the flashlight, catching a figure at the end of the tunnel, pale as moonlight, tall and slender, a robed silhouette with eyes like drowned coals. Behind it, the tunnel opened into a circular chamber where water dripped from the ceiling, pooling into a shallow basin at its center. The toddler's chanting grew louder, but her lips moved slowly now, each syllable deliberate and precise. The robed figure stepped forward, and Father Moreno stumbled back, helpless. The child fell silent mid-chant and turned her blank gaze on him. "He said you would bring me," she said, voice thin and clear. "He said you would make me whole." Father Moreno shook his head. "Isabel, no." He tried to lift her, but she let go, sinking to her knees by the basin. The robed figure knelt opposite her, and they joined hands across the water. The air pulsed with power, an electric stillness that set every nerve on fire. The toddler's small voice rose in that unholy prayer, repeating the waterborne tongue in perfect harmony with the stranger. The walls of the chamber seemed to breathe, pulsing outward as though awakening after centuries of sleep. Father Moreno slid to his knees and tried to interrupt. "Stop this! Stop it now!" But his words were swallowed by the chant, powerless against the ancient invocation. The water in the basin shimmered and rose, swirling into a small vortex that glowed with an inner light like molten silver. The robed figure whispered words that vibrated through the stone, and Isabel's eyes glowed with that same cold light. A sound like screaming filled the chamber, though there was no mouth to breathe it. Father Moreno covered his ears, vision bleaching to white-hot terror, and when he dared open them again, the robed figure stood before him. Its face was revealed, a hollow skull of riverwood, green-black veins crawling across cracked bone, water dribbling from empty eye sockets. It reached out with a skeletal hand, and Father Moreno felt the coldness of death brush his cheek. "You broke the covenant," it said, voice like pebbles grinding, "but the child has claimed the blessing." Isabel stood, her small form trembling with unnatural strength. She tipped her head and regarded him with sorrowful eyes. "Forgive me, Father," she whispered, and the words were not hers. Then she lifted a hand, and the glowing water leapt from the basin, wrapping her in a cocoon of light that pulsed with life and decay all at once. Father Moreno tried to run, but found himself rooted to the spot, as though the river itself held him fast. He fell back as a wave of energy exploded outward, shattering the chamber's silence and tearing at his soul. The last thing he saw before the world went black was Isabel's face, split by a grin too wide, eyes flickering with the reflection of watery eternity. When he woke, the tunnel was empty, the basin dry, the gate standing slightly ajar as though no one had passed through. He crawled out onto the walkway and found the lanterns dark, the river still, silent as a grave. He stumbled toward the water's edge, heart hammering, and saw footprints where Isabel had walked. Tiny prints that were deeper than they should have been, as though made by something heavier, something older. He called her name, voice hoarse, but the only answer was the river's stillness. Then, from the depths came a splash, and a voice whispered his name, a child's voice, familiar and yet drowned by something vast. "Father," it called. And under the ghostly glow of the moon, the water ruffled as if welcoming her home.
The deacon came into the piney woods at dusk, his boots crunching on a carpet of needles that had begun to blacken in concentric circles around the old Harper homestead. He kept his Bible pressed against his chest, thumb marking the verse he would recite first. They'd sent for him at sunset, saying the children cried out at midnight, and the ground itself wept sap as if the trees were bleeding. He remembered the road in, how the long shafts of light slanted between trunks carrying motes of dust that floated like tiny specters. The air smelled of damp earth and something fouler, something like old blood. The Harper place sat where the woods grew thickest, a squat clapboard house whose paint had peeled in sheets like rotting skin. A broken-down barn leaned at the edge of a clearing, its doors gaping open, as if awaiting someone lost. When he stepped onto the porch, the floorboards groaned under his weight, and a cold wind rattled the windows from the inside out. Through the cracks in the shutters, he saw movement, two pale shapes shifting in the dim glow of candles on a table. He set a leather bag down and unlatched it with hands steady, despite the chill creeping up his spine. Inside lay holy water, salt, the crucifix he had worn since seminary. He lifted it to his lips and whispered a prayer, then moved inside. The family waited in the kitchen, a gaunt woman whose husband huddled beside her, and their 3 children, eyes wide, mouths pressed in thin lines. Everything about them felt wrong. Their skin was too pale, as if they'd spent too long underground, and the little boy's hair was matted with pine needles that looked rotten. The deacon knelt before the table, sprinkling salt around their feet in a rough circle. He read from the Psalms, calling on the Lord's light to banish shadows. The woman bowed her head, shoulders shaking. The man's hand trembled around a chipped teacup. He prayed for deliverance, for the blackness that had taken root in these woods to be turned away. At first, nothing happened. Only the wind whispered through the cracks, carrying the scent of decay. Then the candles flickered, and the children looked up. Their eyes were dark hollows, blacker than the circle of scorched earth he'd seen outside. The eldest girl opened her mouth, and a sound like a dozen crows cried out from her throat. The deacon winced, pressing the crucifix to her forehead, murmuring, "In nomine Patri." The candle flames bowed away, as if recoiling. He felt something brush his leg, thin fingers trailing through the ring of salt. He looked down and saw roots crawling over the floorboards, small green tendrils winding toward him. He rose to his feet, voice firm as he commanded the spirits in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, but the roots climbed higher, spiraling around the legs of the chairs and the mother's ankles, Her skin split where the roots touched, and black sap welled from the wounds, staining the linoleum floor. She gasped, her eyes rolling back, and from her mouth grew a voice not her own, speaking in a tongue older than any living man. The deacon stumbled back, dropping his satchel as he tried to find the words of exorcism. The Bible's spine creaked open, pages fluttering to a long-forgotten passage. The words blurred before him, impossible to speak with stammering lips. In that moment, the barn door behind him banged shut. The wind died. The children stared at him with those empty eyes. Then the youngest, a girl of maybe 5, tilted her head and smiled. Her grin split her face, revealing teeth too many, too sharp. The deacon's heart pounded. He raised the crucifix high, voice cracking. "Depart, unclean spirit," he yelled. The black roots recoiled, slithering back beneath the floor. The children let out a screech and tumbled to the ground, writhing like worms. The deacon advanced, stepping over the father who lay unmoving, mouth open in a silent scream. He reached the eldest child, pressing the crucifix to her forehead once more. The air pulsed, the walls groaning under some unseen weight. The candles blew out, and the room went dark. In the blackness, he heard the sap drip, drip, drip onto the wood. The smell of blood and pine grew suffocating. A flash of lightning lit the window, and he saw the truth for the first time. The family's bodies were rooted to the house itself. Their limbs twisted, fused with pine roots that snaked through the walls and under the floor. They were part of the land, their flesh grafted to the rotting house and the cursed woods beyond. Blood seeped into the earth, nourishing the black needles that littered the clearing outside. He shouted the final prayer, voice raw, "Exorcizo te, omnis immunda spiritus." The house shuddered, as though experiencing a death throe. A crack split the ceiling and something heavy fell in the back room. Through the haze of fear, the deacon moved toward the sound, crucifix held before him like a talisman. He stepped through the kitchen, and there, in the dim glow of a second lightning flash, he saw her. The original Harper matriarch, her skin withered, eyes glowing like coals, her hands gnarled like crooked branches. She stood at the door to the barn, silent and still, roots twisting from her wrists into the broken threshold. He tried to speak, but no words came. The spirit raised one hand and beckoned. He took a step forward, then another, drawn as if pulled by some unseen force. The children's screams echoed, and above it all, the dead matriarch's whisper, "Stay with us." The deacon felt the roots at his feet again, tugging. He looked down and saw green shoots pushing through his boots, winding up his legs, tightening. He fell to his knees, crucifix, slamming against the floor. The spirit woman glided toward him, her face half melted into bark and bone. She knelt before him, placed a root-wrapped hand on his chest. He felt his heartbeat slow, the warmth drain from his body. His eyes blurred, the world growing cold and green. He tried to call out to God, to Jesus, to anything, but his voice was gone. The roots coiled around his throat, and he felt his spirit slipping into the land, becoming one with the piney woods. He tasted black sap on his tongue and smelled the earth closing over him. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was the candles flickering back to life, the children crawling toward him, their mouths open in silent laughter. By morning, the clearing looked untouched. The Harper house stood silent, windows dark. Pine needles carpeted the ground, rich and black, forming a perfect circle around the old porch. No footprints marked the soil. The deacon's satchel lay at the threshold, its contents scattered, salt, a shattered crucifix, a Bible whose pages were blank. And at the barn door, 2 small hands reached out, beckoning another visitor into the waiting shadows of Tyler's piney woods.
The air in Waco that March night carried a kind of hush, the kind that settles over a town when history is about to stir from its grave. The watchtower's iron skeleton, what was left of it after the fire, loomed over the smoldering fields like a broken tooth in a dying grin. I stood alone at the edge of that clearing, the cold wind slipping beneath my coat, carrying the faint metallic tang of old blood and splintered wood. Tonight was the 25th anniversary of the massacre, the day the Branch Davidians fell in their makeshift fortress, and only one soul crawled from the ashes. Her name had been Sarah Dawson, and though she lived, something of her had stayed buried in the flames. They told me she carried that something in her eyes and might never be rid of it. That's why I was here, to perform an exorcism as she'd begged, to free her from the terror she wore like skin. I found her kneeling before the collapsed watchtower's base, her back stiff, her hair in a single tangled braid against the bark of my hand-carved cross. Her small form was a candle in the wind, trembling with despair and purpose. The field around us, once the scene of fire and brimstone, was now quiet except for the rustling of reeds by the Brazos, swollen with spring runoff. I knelt beside her, tracing my fingers over her pulse at the hollow of her wrist, and felt it jump against my skin, like an animal caught in a snare, desperate to run but trapped by something unseen. I began the prayers my grandmother had taught me, words of ancient pleading and command, each syllable a stone dropped into a black well. Sarah's breath came in shallow bursts, each one a ragged echo of the day her world had gone up in flames. I pressed the cross against her chest and called out to whatever dark thing had risen from that fire to show itself, to leave her body and find the peace she could never feel while it lurked inside her. The moment the words passed my lips, the wind kicked up, whipping my coat around my legs like a living thing. The reeds bowed and banged on each other as though in applause or warning, and high above, the skeletal tower groaned. Then came the laughter, a soft, distant giggle that turned acidic in my ears. It sounded like children playing and like rats crying out in hunger, all at once. Sarah gasped and clutched my hand, her nails digging into my palm, but her eyes were focused beyond me, on the tower. I raised my head. In the hollow where the platform once stood, a shape materialized, a slim silhouette, limned in flickering orange light, though no flame burned there. The face was Sarah's, but younger, sweeter, furrowed in a cruel smile. Her mouth opened, wider than humanly possible, and outpoured a choir of whispers, the frantic voices of every soul who'd died in the blaze, begging for release or revenge. I squeezed my eyes shut, slamming the cross harder against Sarah's chest, and forced the words out again. "By the blood of the Lamb, I bind you. Leave this vessel." The laughter twisted into shrieks, and the tower creaked as if about to collapse entirely. The ground trembled beneath me. Sarah's body arched in a wrenching spasm, and I felt her bones shift beneath my fingers, the shape inside her bucking like a wild beast. I pressed closer, my face inches from hers, feeling her hot tears splatter against my cheek. Then the world seemed to tilt. The face in the remnants of the tower winked out, and in its place stood a solid form, a man's body charred from shoulder to waist, hands outstretched, eyes burning with accusation. He was one of the Davidians I knew, one of the men who'd gone screaming into the smoke, never to be heard from again. He opened his mouth, and his voice came not as a whisper but as a thunderclap. "You left us." His words rent the air, and for a moment I saw all the desperate faces from that compound. Women shielding children, men clutching Bibles, their flesh aflame, their voices lost in the roar of tanks and fireboats. Sarah screamed and collapsed, her back hitting the soggy earth with a hollow thud. I held her chest with the cross pressed tight, feeling the pressure of her heart struggling to beat. Above us, the watchtower shard rattled, and something like embers drifted down, swirling in the lamplight at the edge of the field. The ghost lifted one hand, pointing at me in silent accusation. He called out again, "You could have saved us. You could have pulled us out before the sky fell on us." I choked on my fear. I had read the records, heard the tapes, studied the siege. Nobody could have breasted that inferno to rescue them. Yet here was something demanding an apology centuries overdue. The wind whipped my hair across my face, and I felt the sting of ash on my tongue. I forced another incantation through clenched teeth and felt the silence press in behind it, a vacuum that threatened to tear my soul. Sarah convulsed, and I tasted her fear alongside my own. I dug my fingers into the mud, drawing strength as though the earth itself would lend me its bones. "By your own blood," I said, voice cracking, "I set you free. Rest now." I pressed the cross into her ribcage one last time, and the ground shuddered. A sickly light swirled around Sarah's body, spinning like smoke caught in a cyclone. The ghost of that man's body stepped forward into it, halting at the boundary of the cyclone, his face contorted in longing. Then the cyclone collapsed inward, imploding with a sound like a million whispered cries cut off at once. The shape of the man blinked and vanished, leaving only a scent of brimstone and wilted flowers. The tower quit its groan, and the wind died. For a moment, everything was silent. I dared to look at Sarah. She lay still, her face slack, color gone, as if she had emptied herself of life and was now waiting for it to return. I pressed my hand against her chest and felt the faint, steady flutter of her heart. Slowly, her eyelids fluttered open. She stared at me with eyes that were no longer haunted. I whispered one word, "Safe," and she tried to smile, but the movement looked strange on her pale face. I helped her to sit up and wrapped my coat around her shoulders. The river murmured beyond the field, and the shattered watchtower rose behind us, silent and static. We left the field by the path that the fire had carved through the grass, the pinyon oak trees standing like silent sentinels on either side. Sarah walked beside me, her head bowed, as though feeling the weight of what she'd shed and what lingered in that empty tower. As we crested the rise and saw the lights of Waco in the distance, I heard a final whisper in my ear, so soft I wasn't sure if it was wind or memory. "We remember." That night, long after Sarah had been tucked into a bed far from these fields, I crawled into my own home and set the cross by the door. Outside, the wind ruffled the curtains, carrying the faint metallic tang of old blood. I lay awake and wondered if those ghosts, hungry for vengeance, voices woven from fire and grief, would ever rest. And somewhere deep in my bones I knew they wouldn't, because history doesn't let go so easily, and vengeance is a hunger that even death cannot sate. The grass on the quad was always too perfect, a cloak of green that felt stitched in place, its seams hidden beneath the careless tread of countless students. On spring evenings, when the sun dipped below the campus oaks and long shadows pooled across the lawn, it seemed to breathe underfoot, as if some secret slumbering thing lurked just below the surface. They said the groundskeepers heard whispers where no one stood, soft sighs drifting through the mower's roar. Still, nobody took it seriously, at least not until the night they disturbed the soil. It began with an old journal bound in crumbling leather, discovered in the depths of the biology lab by a student named Marisol Reyes. She had stayed late, cataloging specimens for her thesis on native plants, when she found the notebook wedged in a cabinet marked discards. Inside were entries from a professor long dead, detailing midnight gatherings beneath the stars, rituals meant to call forth something beyond the laws of nature. The professor wrote of an ancient entity, bound deep under the earth when the first settlers arrived, sacrificed on the hill to protect the town. His words twisted into madness, each page more frantic. They are restless, they claw at the soil, they demand release. Curiosity bloomed like a fungus in Marisol's mind. She shared the journal with her friends. Jason, tall and solemn-faced, always carrying a camera. Priya, whose laughter could light the darkest hallway. And Caleb, the practical one, with hands that never stopped fidgeting. They decided to reenact the rites to see if there was truth in the professor's fevered script. It was college, after all. Late nights were made for dares, for things that felt tempting because they whispered of forbidden knowledge. They chose a secluded corner of the quad, where an outcropping of stone jutted from the earth like knuckles. The ground was softer there, the grass thinner, revealing dark soil that seemed almost damp with something colder than dew. The ritual called for drawn symbols, spirals and interlocking runes, scratched into the earth with a small trowel borrowed from the gardening shed. Marisol read the incantation aloud, her voice trembling but clear, each syllable old as the wind through the oaks. Jason filmed with his camera, its red tally light blinking against the dusk. Priya held her phone's flashlight, its beam dancing like a frightened insect across the symbols. Caleb stood by, hands in his pockets, face pale but determined. They finished before midnight, hearts pounding. A soft wind stirred, rattling loose leaves far overhead, though the air around them lay still. The runes glowed faintly, as though the soil itself pulsed with a heartbeat. Then came the scratching, soft at first, like fingernails against clay just beneath the ground. Jason froze, his camera slipping in his hands. Priya's flashlight slid sideways, chasing shadows. Marisol whispered, "It's just a branch," but her voice cracked. The soil cracked too, a thin line spreading from the center of the spiral, widening as if driven by something from below. They ran. Priya yelped, Jason tripped. Caleb shouted for them to move faster. Their breaths smothered in their throats, the quad yawning around them, empty but for the distant glow of library windows. Behind them, a low moan rose, a collective wail that shook the earth. Grass parted as shapes slithered upward. Figures like outlines of bodies buried long ago, their forms half-formed, dripping soil. Faces emerged, gaunt, eyes black hollows, mouths stretched in silent screams. Hands reached for air, clawing at the ground that had held them captive for centuries. Marisol skidded to a halt at the pathway, her flashlight beam catching one of the figures fully. A woman in a ragged dress stained with dark earth, eyes sunken but alive with anguish. She lifted a hand toward Marisol, fingers elongated, coated in dirt that crumbled with each motion. Marisol's knees buckled. She snapped back, crossing the pavement. The spirit vanished into the grass, swallowed whole, leaving only a smear of mud. They fled across campus, Jason's camera abandoned, Priya's phone lost in the panic, Caleb's keys rattling in his pocket like bones. In the quad behind, the runes burned with phosphorescent light, drawing more shapes to the surface. Men, women, children, some missing eyes, some missing limbs. They stepped out into the open, gathering in silent rows, as though the entire cemetery buried under the lawn had risen in defiance. By dawn, the ground was still. No sign remained of the ritual, no runes, no crack, no soil disturbance. The grass lay flat, untouched. Jason found his camera at the edge of the stones, its battery dead, but still bearing the tinted imprint of spectral shapes in every shot, showed the footage. The images were too raw, too hollow, the frames shimmering as if alive. Instead, he dumped the tape, fearing the silence that followed each spirit's gaze, through the lens. Word spread, as such things do. Students whispered of strange dreams, walking among gravestones etched into sod, voices calling names they never spoke. Professors warned against trespassing on sacred grounds. The administration planted new grass, regraded the earth, banned gardening tools after hours. But nothing could seal the past away. Beneath the manicured lawn, centuries of restless souls churned, waiting for another slip of the trowel, another dared incantation beneath the oaks. On the anniversary of that night, the wind shifts unseasonably cold. The campus falls silent, then quivers with distant murmurs. If you walk the quad when the sky is black and empty, you'll hear it. Scratching. Faint but urgent. You'll feel the grass tremble beneath your shoes as if the lawn had a pulse. And sometimes, if you look down, you'll catch movement. Grass parting like curtains, revealing pale fingers reaching toward the moonlight. Then you'll understand, too late, that some grounds aren't meant for students' experiments, that the dead beneath the quad will not rest, and that the rites meant to free an ancient spirit only invited every restless soul to rise and to stay. The stucco walls of the old West Odessa school groaned under the weight of the desert wind as Father Malone pushed through the warped wooden door and stepped into the darkness. His cassock whispered against shattered tile, the only sound besides the distant hum of an unblinking fluorescent bulb overhead. The other two priests fell in behind him. Father Ruiz, clutching a battered leather-bound missal, and Father Schaefer, whose hands trembled as he adjusted the stole around his neck. They had come here because the local bishop believed the school, long abandoned since the flood of '97, harbored something profane, something that defied God's mercy. Malone struck a match, and the tiny flare revealed desks arranged in a precise circle, their scratched surfaces glinting like teeth in the dim light. The chalkboard at the front was smeared in scrawled names, 23 in total, written in jagged white. They weren't Latin or any ancient tongue. They were common American names, names Malone recognized from the parish register: Mary Aguilar, Joseph Hardin, Raymond Wells. Each name felt like a trespass, as though the board itself had stolen the souls of the baptized and claimed them for something dark. "Stand here," Father Ruiz whispered, voice uneven. He marked points in the circle with small piles of salt, his fingers shaking as he set down each grain. The dusty air tasted of rot and chalk dust. Malone felt sweat bead behind his collar, though the Texas night was cool for once. The three of them formed a triangle around the final mound of salt, leaving an empty space between them that Malone sensed was deliberate, as if the circle was incomplete until an unseen fourth signer stepped in. Ruiz began in a low chant, words drawn from centuries-old exorcism rites. His voice echoed in the classroom, dulling against the boarded windows. Schaefer joined, hesitant but resolute, and Malone offered the sacramental psalms, his voice firm, though his mind quivered. The circle of desks seemed to pulse, shifting imperceptibly, inching toward them. Malone blinked and saw that the desk's legs scraped across the tile, leaving faint gouges as they realigned themselves in a tighter formation. The priests pressed on, but the temperature plunged, their breaths coming in white puffs. The overhead bulb flickered, threatening to die at any moment. Malone sensed movement behind him, and when he turned, there was a girl in a tattered uniform, a ghostly child with hollow eyes, standing at a broken desk. Her mouth opened in a silent wail, and Malone felt a cold finger graze his ankle. He stumbled, heart pounding as he realized the names on the chalkboard were bleeding, thick black fluid oozing down the board in ribbons, pooling at the base in sticky puddles. Ruiz gasped and fell to his knees, salt scattering. Schaefer cried out, voice cracking. But Malone lunged to steady Ruiz and shoved him backward. The girl's lips moved, but no sound emerged. Yet Malone heard a whisper that seemed to crawl beneath his skin. "We are here. We are here." A second girl came into view, then a third. Children in various states of decay, eyes like coal, hands stretched out as though begging for absolution. They swirled around the circle of desks, their bare feet scuffing the floor, their forms jittery like static on a broken television set. The priests' voices wavered, the sacred Latin warping into wails of terror. Malone forced himself to keep chanting, to grip the crucifix at his throat and hold it high. The ghost children closed in, names murmuring from their cracked lips. He recognized his own parishioners' names among the scribbles on the board. He had baptized Mary Aguilar himself. He had served communion to Joseph Hardin. Now their spirits, if they were spirits, were bound here, trapped by a curse older than the building's foundation. One child lunged at Schaefer, passing through him as though he were mist, leaving Schaefer's eyes empty and ebony. Ruiz screamed and rolled away, but Malone grabbed him, dragging him to the door. The chalkboard names glowed now, pulsing in rhythm with the children's heartbeat chants. "Release me!" they cried, voices overlapping until they formed a single rumble beneath the priest's prayers. Malone's voice cracked, but he thrust the crucifix forward and declared the final words of the exorcism. For an instant, the room fell silent, the oppressive stillness that crushes the soul. Then the desks shattered outward, propelled by an unseen force. Wood and metal fragments gouged the walls as the desks slammed into their makers with bone-crushing thuds. Malone heard Ruiz's bones snap beneath the blow. Schaefer's body twisted unnatural angles before he was thrown into the boarded windows, glass splintering like ice. Malone was hurled across the room, landing against the chalkboard. The wet names pressed cold against his back. He felt the pulse of the curse thrumming through the wood. He didn't know how long he lay there, bleeding and gasping for air, until the children's whispers faded and the desks lay broken in ruin. The salt rings were gone, dissolved like they had never existed. The bulb overhead winked back to life, revealing just Malone in the wreckage, alone. He stumbled to his feet, clutching the crucifix as though it were the only thing keeping him tethered to the world of the living. The doors groaned open, and the night wind sluiced through the hall, carrying the echo of tiny footsteps retreating down the corridor. Malone stepped out onto the cracked pavement, heart hammering so hard he thought he might collapse. He didn't look back at the boarded windows. He didn't want to see those names smeared on the chalkboard, bleeding into the silence. Behind him, in the hollows of the deserted school, something watched. A laughter that sounded like shattering chalk on tile drifted on the wind, and Malone knew the mass had not ended. It had only begun. He dropped to his knees in the desert dust, tears burning his eyes as he whispered a broken prayer for the souls of the innocent, and for his own. And somewhere in the darkness beyond, the faint scratch of chalk resumed, writing new names on a hidden board that no light would ever touch. The night air above McAllen's abandoned mercado carried a smell that was almost alive, a sweaty, cloying scent like fear left out in the sun too long. The stalls sat silent, their wooden frames splintered and half-collapsed, their once gleaming tin roofs rusted into pockmarked moons. At the far edge of the plaza, a faded sign swung on a single squeaking hinge, Mercado Fronterizo, Apertura a la medianoche. It hadn't been open in decades. There was nothing here but ghosts, until Father Villarreal and Doña Celestina arrived. Villarreal was brief and pale, his cassock soaked through with sweat from the taxi ride across town, his collar askew as though some invisible hand had yanked him by the throat. Celestina wore shawls that looked like patchwork rainbows, reds and greens, and mustard yellows that might have once been vibrant but, in the muted glow of her lantern, seemed nearly black. She moved with a deliberate grace, her bare feet silent on the cracked flagstones. The priest's boots scuffed like an intruder, and every few steps he crossed himself, lips moving in a mutter of prayers he'd long since stopped believing. They met in the center of the plaza, beneath the skeletal roof of what had once been an espolvorera stall. Doña Celestina set down her leather-bound satchel and unwrapped a coil of beads threaded with bone fragments. Villarreal produced a small, leather-bound prayer book, its pages curled from damp. For a moment, they just stared at each other across a distance that felt miles wide, two strangers bound by the rumor of something wicked stirring just beneath the surface of this forsaken place. "Estás lista?" the priest asked, voice trembling enough that it could have passed for reverence. Celestina only nodded. She began, her voice low and guttural, chanting in words older than the Spanish spoken by any living soul. The beads slipped through her fingers, each skull-shaped fragment clicking like a heartbeat. Villarreal opened his book and joined in, his Latin clipped and uneven, as though his heart fought his tongue for control. The air grew cold, a dry wind swirling grit and the faint, sour odor of rot around them. Shadows leapt against the walls as the Mercado's empty stalls shuddered, wood moaning, metal rattling. At first, it was nothing but the wind. Then came the scratching. At first tentative, like fingernails on bone, then urgent, desperate, as though something just on the edge of perception clawed at the reality they occupied. The priest and the healer glanced up, eyes wide, and in that breathless instant they saw it. Deeper in the stall beyond them, behind torn burlap curtains stained with mildew, something pressed against the fabric. A hand, pale as death, slid into view, fingers splayed, and the scratching stopped, leaving a pulse of terrified silence. Celestina's beads spun through the air, scattering across the stones. Villarreal's prayer book flipped pages violently, settling open at a page he'd never seen before. No words he recognized, only symbols that writhed across the paper like living things. A low moan rose from the darkness beyond the curtains, an animal sound, wet and hungry. With a suddenness that stole their breath, the curtains tore away. The thing that emerged was far taller than any man, its limbs elongated at grotesque angles. Its head was too small for its body, hairless and smooth, with two pits where eyes should have been and a mouth that stretched from cheek to cheek, filled with black teeth that clicked and ground together in a terrible rhythm. Its skin was a patchwork of scars and fresh wounds, a map of torment that oozed a dark ichor. The priest froze, fear pinning his feet to the ground. Celestina fell to her knees, scraping her palms against the stone in a frantic attempt to rise. The creatures stood motionless, as though deciding how to taste their terror. Then it took a step, a movement that sounded like the tearing of cloth, and the earth trembled beneath them. Father Villarreal raised his book, voice cracking, and began to recite an exorcism prayer, words he barely remembered from seminary, a jumble of syllables that meant nothing but were born of desperation. Celestina spat curses in tongues older than the church itself, slamming her palm to the ground so hard the flagstones cracked. From her satchel, she withdrew a small jar of red powder and scattered it in a circle that glowed faintly in the lantern's light. The creature halted at the circle's edge. Its head tilted, as though confused by the barrier. Then it lunged forward, mouth opening impossibly wide. A scream ripped from the priest's throat, but it was swallowed by the beast's howl. A sound not of this world, a tearing of dimensions. A scream from beyond the veil. The circle flared, a ring of fireless light that pushed back the darkness, and the creature recoiled, claws scrabbling for purchase on the broken stone. "Now!" Celestina shouted, voice echoing around the ruined stalls. Together they spoke the final incantation, syllables rolling off their tongues in a crescendo that rattled every tile in the mercado. The glowing circle pulsed once, twice, then shattered with a crack like thunder. The creature shrieked, a sound that pierced the soul, and lunged toward the priest. In that moment, time shattered. The priest's eyes went white, and he lurched forward, knocking Celestina aside with inhuman strength. The healer crashed against a stall, her lantern shattering, oil igniting in a flare that painted everything in red and orange. The creature seized Villarreal's throat, crushing it with spindly fingers. Blood spurted, the pressing darkness blooming in sticky arcs. Celestina rose, coughing smoke and panic, her hands grasping at the air for one final spell. She found her beads, raised them overhead, and hurled them at the beast's face. The bone fragments shattered against invisible flesh, sending splinters of white across the frescoed walls of this desecrated market. The creature recoiled, hands covering where its eyes should have been. Celestina seized the priest's crucifix, pressed it to the creature's chest, and whispered a word so ancient that the air around them whispered back. The beast convulsed, joints popping in sickening recognition of some celestial law it could not break. It collapsed, dimensions folding into itself, until all that remained was a pile of blackened bones and a faint echo of a scream that faded into the wind. The fire guttered and died. Smoke curled toward a half-crescent moon. Celestina sank to the stones, her shawls heavy with soot and ash. Father Villarreal lay on the ground beside her, eyes dull, mouth gaping. She crawled to him, pressed her hand to his chest, a pulse, weak but alive. Tears stung her eyes as she gathered him in her arms. Behind them, the mercado stood silent once more. The stalls were still. The wind was gone. Only the moon watched, impartial and unblinking. Celestina stared at the empty plaza, chest heaving, and whispered an apology to the dead and the living alike. She did not know if she had saved a man or damned a soul, only that the mercado's shadows had been given life tonight, and fed their hunger on the line between faith and fear. She stood, clutching the priest's cassock. In her satchel, the jar of red powder lay cracked, its contents spilled into the cracks. Above, the old sign swung on its hinge, inscribed words catching the moonlight. Apertura a la medianoche. She turned and walked away, the broken beads of bone trailing like ghosts behind her, and the mercado breathed again, nostrils flaring, waiting for the next who dared to open its gates at midnight. The night the lights went out in Beaumont, they say the city held its breath, waiting for the darkness to swallow it whole. It began with one flicker, an abrupt jerk in the street lamps outside Orange Avenue, then a collective hush, as if the whole town paused, suspended on the moment before a long scream. Dr. Carlos Alvarez, pastor at the modest First Unity Church, stood beside his pulpit, mid-sermon, the last echo of his words vanishing into sudden blackness. The stained glass windows were nothing but opaque silhouettes now, and the choir's hopeful hymn died on their lips. In that hungry void, something old and hungry stirred. Carlos knew almost instantly that the blackout was citywide. He checked his phone, no signal, the screen as dead as the church's fluorescent fixtures. Far beyond the nave, somewhere in the back pews, congregants shifted nervously. He felt their fear as a tangible weight, heavier than his cassock. In the stories his grandmother used to whisper, darkness was never just absence. It was a doorway. If you stared too long, it would stare back. He decided then that this night must be met head-on. He cleared his throat and called for calm, voice echoing hollowly. "Brothers and sisters," he said, stepping down the pulpit stairs as if the altar were a lifeboat in a storm of shadows. "Tonight's darkness is nothing we cannot face together." Outside, the wind carried the distant roar of traffic dying off, car horns cut silent, engines choking to nothing. A few candles flickered in the windows of homes along Crockett Street, tiny lighthouses in a sea of black. Word passed quickly among the faithful. An impromptu baptism would ward off fear, affirm faith. Carlos agreed. He fetched a metal basin, filled it from the old baptismal font, and placed it center stage. He lit the few candles on the altar with his Zippo, flames dancing on the brass rim, casting giant, trembling shadows on peeling plaster walls. People came forward, one by one. Mrs. Hargrove with her arthritic knees, Mr. Nguyen clutching his son's hand. Teenagers who exchanged uneasy glances as they stepped into the flickering light, willing themselves braver than they felt. A hush fell over the church as the first infant was lifted, tiny fists curled, bright eyes catching candlelight, reflecting everything they did not yet understand about fear. Carlos laid hands on the child's brow, spoke words older than memory. The basin water glimmered, rippling in the candle glow. Behind him, beyond the reach of fragile light, someone coughed. He turned, heart thudding. There, at the back, stood a figure more human than ghost. Tall, gaunt, face hidden beneath a hooded cloak stained with shadows. It looked like any other worshiper at first, but for the way it moved, too slow, too precise, without the tremor of breath or breath's mist in the cool night air. When Carlos dipped his fingers into the water, the basin rattled as if something inside threshed against the metal sides. The congregation gasped. The infant wailed. The hooded figure took a step forward. The candles guttered. One by one, the lights of every candle in the church died until only the one on Carlos's altar remained, a lone sentinel of yellow flame in a sea of obsidian. Then they came. First one, then another, then dozens, hissing shapes that emerged from the windows, from the cracks around the door frames, from the corners where walls met floor. They slid across the wooden pews like oil-slick serpents, twisting and elongating, faces loose and blank but for the mouths. Mouths that opened wide, jaws unhinging beyond anatomical sense, revealing rows of needle teeth set in rubbery pink flesh. And from those teeth came the sound, a collective, bone-chilling hiss, a breath that sounded like steam escaping from an ancient boiler. The congregation stumbled backward. Some cried out, some fled down the side aisles, but the doors refused to open, locked by unseen hands or perhaps by the very darkness itself. Carlos stood frozen, the infant still in his arms, water dripping onto the floor, sizzling quietly. He knew ritual might save them. But what ritual worked against things older than the cross, creatures born of fear itself? He raised the child high and shouted the baptismal prayer. Water fanned out across the floorboards, each drop hissing as it hit the floor, as if the building itself recoiled. The hooded figure glided forward, raising a pale hand. Behind it, the hissing shapes gathered, coiling, hungry. For a heartbeat, the candle flame trembled, as if afraid to burn in such company. Then it flared, bright as hope, and Carlos thrust the baby's dripping toes toward the faces that hovered in the gloom. At that moment, the hissing stopped. silence fell so thick it pressed against eardrums. Then everything moved in a blink. The cloaked shape lunged, a tidal wave of darkness lurching toward the altar. Carlos stumbled, arms outstretched, a swirl of baptismal water flying through the air, sending rivulets across the cracked tile. The candle blew out, plunging everything into absolute night. He heard the scrape of cloaks against tile, the soft slap of shadow flesh, the quick, silent number of claws drawing closer. Carlos closed his eyes, whispered the Lord's Prayer, clutching the baby to his chest. A whisper of flame flickered, a single match igniting under his fingers. He held it so that its flame faced the creatures. Gold light met black. The creatures recoiled, twisting backs as if retreating from barbed wire. The match burned low. Carlos dropped it into the basin. The water caught fire in a moment's impossible gleam, blue and fierce, flaring into an incandescent wall between him and the shapes. Light spilled out in waves, illuminating the baptized in the broken pews, the gouges left by unseen claws. The figures hissed and shrank, shadows bending back into crevices, until only the hooded one remained, standing beside the wreck of the baptismal font. Its cloak slid off, revealing a figure made of wet black smoke, dripping onto the floor like tar. Where a face should be was only an endless void, hungry, infinite. It reached out, a twisting abscess of darkness. Carlos raised his voice, louder than he had ever dared, crying out a blessing that mixed Latin and English, words meant to forge light where there was none. The smoke shape shuddered, contorted, then burst in a pop like a balloon of midnight, an echoing crack that shook plaster from the ceiling. The blackness collapsed inward, pooling like spilled ink, then sucked upward into the broken lamp sockets. Behind it rose a new sound, the abrupt hum of electricity returning, fuses clicking, and one by one the lights came back on. Fluorescent tubes buzzed, revealed cracks in walls, and showed the crowd standing amidst water and scorched candle stubs. Carlos sank to his knees, baby in his arms, heart hammering. The congregation huddled close, eyes wide, faces pale. Nothing moved in the corners now. The church was still. Only the smell of burnt candle wax and something fouler, the stink of fear, lingered. He whispered a final prayer, barely audible. Outside, the hum of generators and cars resumed. In the harsh white light, everyone looked around as though waking from a dream. Mrs. Hargrove fumbled for her purse. Mr. Nguyen gathered his son. The teenagers exchanged shaky laughter, as if the world beyond those walls had never stopped spinning. Carlos rose, careful not to spill a drop of the baptismal water. He stepped aside so all might see the basin, still crackling with tiny blue flames before fading at last. The baby, now silent in sleep, wriggled free and reached an arm toward the congregation's bobbing heads, as though beckoning them to remember what had been fought that night. They filed past, touching the brim of the basin, murmuring prayers of thanks. Outside, the city lights glared on like 1,000 watchful eyes. The darkness, beaten back for now, pressed at every window waiting. Beaumont's blackout baptism was over, but when the lights had fully returned, and people had returned to their beds, no one spoke of the hissing shapes that had filled the dark. No one but Carlos, who in a whisper to himself vowed never to let the candles burn low again, for he knew what lived in the gap between flame and shadow, and that it would be back. The dust motes drifted through the late afternoon light that slanted in through the stained glass windows of the little chapel, pooling at the base of the rough-hewn pews like ghosts reluctant to move on. Inside, the air hung heavy with the mingled scents of varnish and age, church incense still faintly clinging to the stone walls, though no service had been held here for years. Father Lucian Hayes stood at the threshold, his black cassock catching on the peeling wooden door frame as he stepped inside. He carried nothing but a battered leather satchel of ritual implements, a handful of old crucifixes, a small vial of holy oil, and a worn prayer book whose edges curled like burned paper. He had been summoned to Kerrville by a local historian, a wiry man named Travis Boone, who believed he'd discovered a hidden alcove behind the altar, an alcove never mentioned in any records. The story, rumor had it, was that this remote chapel had been the site of exorcisms long before Texas was even a state, when German settlers still whispered of Wendigos stalking the canyons at night. The historian had expected to find a sealed niche, perhaps a forgotten reliquary or some relic lost to time. But he never told Lucian about the smell. Lucian moved toward the altar, his footsteps echoing on the cool flagstone floor. The altar cloth was moth-tattered, and the once bright embroidery of wheat sheaves had faded to a ghostly gray. Above it, the greatest crucifix in the chapel, hands and face carved with impossible realism, seemed to stretch in silent agony. Lucian paused, unable to tear his eyes away from the figure's hollowed cheekbones and the glazed look in its eyes. For an instant, he thought the eyes had followed him. He shook his head as if to clear a bad dream and forced himself forward. Travis stood to one side, arms folded, jaw clenched. "I marked it for you here," he said, voice low. He tapped the mortar joint between two stones at the base of the altar. The stones looked the same as the others, save for a faint outline of chalk. "Been here forever, they say." He frowned. "It smells off." Lucian pressed a thumb to the stone, felt a hum beneath his skin like faint heartbeats. He drew back his sleeve, uncorked the vial of holy oil, and anointed the seam. The oil sizzled against the cold rock, steam curling upward in thin gray trails. Travis caught his breath. The priest crossed himself, murmured a prayer, then set to work. First, he read aloud from Psalm 91, voice steady, the words rolling in Latin and English like thunder over a plain. Then he traced a cross in the air, drew from his satchel an ornate key, ancient brass, heavy enough to bruise a fingertip, and fitted it into a keyhole no larger than a thumbnail. The key turned with a grind that made the chapel tremble. Pale dust exploded between the stones, and Lucian staggered backward, coughing. Travis cursed and covered his mouth. As the dust settled, the stones shifted, rocking forward on a hidden hinge, revealing a shallow niche just tall enough for a slender figure. Candles wrapped in decayed gold leaf lay in 2 rows along the back wall, their wicks long burned. A small wooden box, blackened with age, sat on a low stone shelf. Lucien felt the hair on his arms stand on end. He advanced, hand trembling against the brass crucifix he held. "In nomine Patris," he whispered, reaching for the box. When his fingers brushed the lid, a whisper spilled into the room, a rustle of syllables too soft to understand. He froze. Travis, pale and wide-eyed, gripped the pew behind him. The whispering grew louder, filling every corner of the chapel, like wind through a forest of dead pines. Then came the second voice, deeper, like a chant underwater, rattling the bone. Lucien yanked the small box free and slammed it shut. The whispering stopped as abruptly as it began. Silence pressed in, so thick he could taste it on his tongue. Inside the box, he saw a single object, a length of twisted iron wire, looped at one end, with a curious, jagged hook at the other. He felt a raw heat behind his eyes, as though the chapel itself was watching. Travis stammered, "Father, what? What is that?" Lucian swallowed, voice ragged. "I don't know." He set the box on the altar, left the wire untouched. He spoke a blessing, but it sounded hollow in the heavy stillness. The candles flickered, though there was no breeze. The crucifix on the wall began to warp, the figure's limbs elongating, the hollow eyes growing darker, as if ink spilled behind them. Lucian tried to steady himself. "We must finish the rite," he said, pulling out incense. He lit it, then swung the censer in a slow circle. The smoke curled into the alcove, mingling with the stale air. As the smoke reached the hidden space, it billowed back, thick and black, trailing into the main chamber. The candles inside the niche flared, each flame snapping to life, though their wicks were ash. The historian shrieked, stumbling back into the pews, knocking them over. The chapel walls trembled. A low moan emanated from the stones themselves, and then, faint but distinct, words formed. Half a dozen syllables repeated over and over. Lucian recognized the language of the fallen, prayers no priest should ever utter. Desperation clawed at him. He clutched the censer tightly, swung it toward the alcove. "By power of Christ, I command you, be gone." The words barely left his lips when the alcove vomited forth a shape darker than shadow. It spilled across the floor. 8 long talons, 2 malformed wings, and a mass of slick tendrils that writhed like serpents. Its eyes were 2 pits of incorporeal void, looking at them with impossible hunger. The chapel's floorboards buckled under its weight, groaning like bones. Travis screamed and fled for the door. Lucian cast the censer at the creature. It shattered against an ancient column, and clouds of incense drifted upward, but the creature shrugged them off as mist from a morning field. The crucifix on the wall groaned and split, the carved Christ falling with a crack that echoed like thunder. The creature tilted its head, as though amused. Lucian bolted toward the alcove. He yanked the iron hook from the box. Its surface was slick with a vile warmth. He drove it into the creature's side, expecting resistance, but the hook slid in as though through water. A keening cry split the air. The walls quivered and the whispering returned, louder now. A chorus of tortured voices. Lucien wrenched the hook free. The creature recoiled, and in that moment the priest thrust the hook into the mortar joint above the alcove and pried. A stone gave way and the creature shrieked as it was sucked back, tendrils trailing like smoke, its talons scraping on stone. The alcove slammed shut, sealing with a reverberation that rattled Lucian's teeth. Silence descended again, almost as terrifying as the chaos that had preceded it. The candles guttered and died. Lucien sank to his knees, gasping. Travis peered from behind the fallen pew, shaking, eyes red. The chapel was still, but the walls seemed to pulse. Lucien's ears rang with the echo of the whispers. He stood, collected his satchel, and walked to the door. The evening light had fled, and the chapel lay in shadow. As he reached for the handle, a single whisper rasped through the keyhole. His name, spoken with a voice like dry leaves. He froze. Without turning, he pushed open the door and stepped into the dusk. Behind him, in that restless chapel deep in the hills, he left the hook and whatever burden it carried. As he walked down the overgrown path toward Careville, he heard the stones shift once more, and beneath the chapel's ancient roof, the walls began to whisper again. The air in the Cantina del Rio hung heavy with the sour tang of spilled tequila and the metallic hint of fear. Flickering neon slashes of red and green cut through the gloom, painting stained windows and scarred wooden beams with a lurid carnival light. A handful of late stragglers nursed their last rounds at the bar, voices low and rough as gravel, each glance toward the heavy oak double doors at the back betraying a hope that last call had not yet come. Padre Ignacio Vega stood hunched beside the amber bottles, a battered leather satchel at his feet and a length of rosary beads coiled around his wrist. He had answered the owner's plea an hour ago, summoned here by a frantic phone call in the dying embers of twilight. A man, known to these parts as El Indio, had begun speaking in tongues, clawing at his own flesh, and growling in a voice that did not belong to him. They called it demonic, though most opted for the easier explanation: meth, isolation, delirium. But Ignacio had seen the marks of something older, something patient and hungry, and he had come dressed in cassock and faith, determined to save a soul before it slipped away. The stools at the bar rattled as a windless draft swept through the room, scattering sugar packets and napkins. El Indio sat slumped on a swiveling stool, eyes rolled back until only the whites glowed, veins black knots beneath thin flesh. His breath came in ragged bursts, each exhalation a rattling prayer that cut through the musician's scratchy country tune, playing faintly from a battered jukebox. Ignacio's voice trembled as he whispered the opening invocation: "In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen." The words felt heavy as lead on his tongue. Even after 2 decades exorcising drunk-fueled spirits and half-believed hauntings, each rite pulled him back to the raw terror of his first commandment: cast out devils, but understand that they, too, knew the ancient words. A sudden crash made every head spin. The bar stools, barely a handful remaining past midnight, lifted from the floor, legs scraping in protest, pivoting in a silent, grotesque dance. Thin vinyl seats rotated as if guided by invisible hands. The bartender, pale as unbleached linen, froze mid-pour, eyes fixed on the spectacle. No gust answered him when he slid the window shut. The neon buzz dimmed for a heartbeat, then roared back brighter, the crimson cross above the door flickering in a staccato heartbeat. Ignacio's heart pounded in time with it. He knelt before El Indio, palms pressed against the man's shoulders as the stool wobbled beneath them. "Sit still," Ignacio ordered softly, though his voice cracked. "In the name of the Lord, I command you, show yourself." A growl crawled from deep within Indio's throat, more a shuddering animal sound than human speech. The man's head whipped around, and when he spoke it was in a chorus of voices. One silky feminine whisper, 2 guttural grunts, a child's whimper. Each syllable dropped like a stone into the priest's gut. The room plunged into oppressive silence, broken only by that fractured choir. Then the stools began to sway, moving closer in a slow orbit around the priest and his victim. Chairs scraped the rough wooden floor, each click of metal against wood like the ticking of a clock counting down to something irrevocable. The patrons, half drunk, half spooked, huddled near the walls, eyes wide, hands trembling around glasses that might have held courage. A stray dog, small and mangy, slipped in through a side door and froze, ears flattened, tail twitching in a jerky rhythm. Ignacio rose to his feet, pulling a small vial of holy water from his satchel. He uncorked it with deliberate calm, allowing beads of sweat to roll down his temples. Eyes flicking upward, he invoked the blessing. "Asperges me, Domine, hyssopo et mundabor." He flicked droplets across El Indio's face. The water sizzled on contact, steaming as if meeting scorching flesh. A howl erupted that shook the rafters, sending a cascade of dust motes dancing in the neon glare. The dog yelped and fled, disappearing into the alley beyond the smashed window. "By the power vested in me," Ignacio shouted, voice booming against the low ceiling, "I bind you, unclean spirit. Depart this man and return to the pit from which you crawled." He brandished a simple iron cross, beaten flat by years of use. The neon glow reflected off its surface, casting twin shadows that danced like specters on the walls. El Indio's body arched backward, stool legs screeching as he rocked on two wheels. Sweat and blood mingled on his brow, the rosary glinting between his fingers as he clawed at it. For a moment, everything stilled. The jukebox clicked over to silence. The bar lights dimmed until only the cross overhead shone, a circular halo of red and green. In that silence, Ignacio thought he felt the heartbeat of something vast awakening beneath the tavern's foundation, a slow pulse that vibrated in the soles of his boots, the drums of ancient drums. He looked down at El Indio, whose eyes had returned to their pale, glassy normalcy. With a final, desperate prayer, Ignacio thrust the cross forward and recited the last verse of the exorcism rite. The words trembled on his lips. "Go forth, unclean spirit, and trouble this place no more." The second the syllable "more" left his mouth, a roar filled the cavernous room. Stools sprang upright in a single motion, launching toward the priest like wooden missiles. He barely ducked behind the bar, iron cross held in front of him, watching as the heavy oak projectiles thudded into bottles and glasses, shattering everything in their path. Splintered wood rained down, cutting through the air with sickening precision. The neon lights flickered again, and, when they steadied, the chairs lay in broken heaps, as if some giant hand had crumpled them. Silence settled over the carnage. A solitary glass teetered on the bar's edge, a smear of crimson across its rim. The bartender stared at Ignacio, pupils dilated beyond reason. He took a trembling breath. "Padre, it's over." Ignacio shook his head, chest heaving. He stepped over shards of oak and shattered glass, kneeling beside El Indio. The man lay still, eyes closed, chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. His face, once contorted in torment, now looked peaceful, as though wrapped in a dreamless sleep. The priest closed his eyes, murmuring the final benediction, "Dominus vobiscum." He placed a hand on the man's brow, blessing him back to the land of the living. Then he felt it, a cold finger brushing along his spine, a quiet, mocking amusement in the air. He turned, heart lodged in his throat, and saw the neon cross above the door flicker out. In the sudden darkness, every shadow gathered at the edges of his vision. The breath of the bar seemed to grow deeper, alive with its own heartbeat. Ignacio rose, cross raised, voice trembling. "Who's there? Show yourself." No answer came, only the slow drip of a spilled drink pooling onto broken tile. When the neon cross sputtered back to life, ghostly green light spilled across the bar. In that moment, the stools, those same broken pieces of jutting oak, levitated, reassembling themselves midair. Legs knitted back together, seats clicking into place, forming a perfect semicircle around the priest. Not a single patron moved. Even El Indio's chest stilled. Ignacio's throat tightened. The room pulsed with anticipation, as if the building itself grinned in mockery. The cross in his hand swung heavy, useless. He felt the ancient weight of something awakening, a presence older than sin, more patient than decay. And in that moment, he understood the truth. This was no simple possession. This was a domain, and tonight he was its guest. He lowered the iron cross, voice scarcely a whisper. "I yield to the will of God." The stools halted their assembly, hovering in midair like a congregation of silent witnesses. Then, as though snapping a final applause, they fell apart once more, raining splinters over the dust-choked floor. The neon cross died again, plunging the Cantina del Rio into an abyss of darkness so complete it felt like drowning. And after that, Ignacio heard nothing but his own ragged breath and the soft, satisfied whisper of something ancient, weaving itself back into the shadows, waiting for the next last call.